Hey guys, and welcome! So glad you're here. Tonight, we're not going to be wandering through fancy castles with kings and queens, or watching knights clank around in their shiny armor. Nope, we are diving in, head first, way deep, into the mucky, smelly, and, honestly, pretty bizarre world of medieval jobs. You won't believe some of this stuff. Seriously, forget everything you think you know. We're pulling back the curtain on jobs so awkward, so... stomach churning. They'd make your absolute worst Monday morning feel like a vacation. These were the gigs that kept the medieval world from falling apart, often done by folks who didn't have a whole lot of other choices, in conditions that would totally freak us out today. So, before you get all snuggled in, if you're digging these little adventures into the weirder bits of history, how about giving that like button a little tap? And hey, if you're new around here, maybe hit subscribe. Let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always so cool to see where our story-loving crew is scattered around the globe. Alright then, got your imaginary smelling salts handy? You might need them. Good, because tonight we're checking out the most awkward jobs in the Middle Ages. And trust me, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a serious testament to how tough people can be. Think about the Middle Ages for a sec. A time of flickering candles and shadows that probably danced with all sorts of spooky superstitions. For most folks back then, life wasn't some grand, exciting adventure. It was hard. Like, really hard. Remember those charming peasant huts we chatted about? You know, mud walls, roofs that leaked like crazy, and definitely no central heating to fight over? Now, just try to imagine earning a living in that world. A world with zero health and safety inspectors, no proper sanitation to speak of, and where your job could literally kill you, or at the very least, make you super unpopular with the neighbors. These are the stories of the people who did the yucky work, the essential, usually unseen, and almost always unthanked heroes of their time. So take a deep breath, but maybe not too deep, okay? Considering where we're about to go, and let's step into their worn-out, mud-caked boots, one super awkward job at a time. Okay, so picture this. The medieval town is super quiet. Almost too quiet, you know? Curfew bells. They rang ages ago, and now there's just this thick, heavy silence hanging over all those twisty, narrow streets. Maybe you hear a dog bark way off in the distance, or a rat skittering in some dark alley, or someone coughing in a hut nearby. But for you, dear listener, your workday? It's only just kicking off. Because tonight, you, my friend, are a gong farmer. Sounds kind of fancy, right? Gong farmer? Like you grow something special? Or maybe you're the guy who rings those big booming bells in the church tower? Oh, if only it were that cool. In medieval England, and way before then too, gong meant something, well, a whole lot less glamorous, let's just say. It was the everyday word for, you guessed it, the privy, the latrine, the outhouse, the jakes, and, yep, all the stuff that ended up in there. And you? You're the brave soul who has to dig it all out. Your job, it's a strictly nighttime gig. We're talking between 9 p.m., when all the good folks are locking their doors up tight, and 5 a.m., just when the first rooster is thinking about clearing its throat. And no, this isn't because you're some kind of vampire with a really weird side hustle. It's because, let's be honest, nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to see, or more importantly, smell what you're getting up to in broad daylight. Your job is so powerful, so incredibly fragrant. It's literally against the law to do it when the sun's out. This whole working in the dark thing, while a big relief for everyone else's noses, probably didn't do wonders for your social calendar, you know? So, who are your trusty sidekicks in this smelly business? Definitely not knights in shining armor, that's for sure. You've got your super sturdy shovels, your strong, deep buckets, probably wooden, maybe lined with pitch to stop them from, well, soaking up too much of the local essence. You've got a rickety old ladder for those extra deep plunges, and your ever-faithful horse and cart, a cart that's definitely seen some things. And smelled some things. Lots of times, you'll have a young apprentice with you, maybe it's your own kid, or some poor lad who didn't have many other job offers. Small, quick, Great for wiggling into tight spots and hauling up those buckets that are way heavier than they look. He's learning the family business the really hard way. Your main target, night after stinky night? The cesspit. That deep, dark hole, sometimes lined with bricks if you're lucky, sometimes just a hole, dug right under the household privy. In the courtyard, down in the cellar, hidden away in a tiny back garden, that's where the gold, of a sort, is buried. Now, just try to imagine this for a second. You're lowering yourself down, into the cold, into the damp, into the absolutely overwhelming, all-consuming stench. Whoa. The air is so thick, you could practically chew it. Sometimes you're knee-deep in it. Sometimes it's up to your waist. And on a really bad night, the kind of night that gives you nightmares, you could be up to your neck in the town's collective, well, history. They say even Queen Elizabeth I, and you know she was used to fancy things, once had to pack her royal bags and get out of Hampton Court Palace because they were emptying the royal cesspit. The smell was so awful, they thought it might actually harm her. So if the Queen of England herself is running for the hills, you, my friend, are diving in headfirst. Yikes. The smell? Oh man, let's just take a little breather and talk about the smell. It's not just one smell, okay? It's like a full-on orchestra of stink. Everything a medieval town ate, drank, and then, got rid of, all just bubbling away together in this rich, dark, gloopy soup. And it gets everywhere. Into your clothes, into your hair, under your fingernails. It pretty much becomes your personal perfume. You are a walking, talking, and smelling advertisement for your job, like it or not. Some of your buddies, in later Tudor times, actually tried smoking tobacco to cover up the odor. You gotta wonder if that just added a lovely layer of burnt leaves to the already exciting bouquet. Talk about a desperate move for a desperate situation. And the feel of it, okay, this isn't going to be pleasant, but stick with me here. It's thick, it's heavy, it's slimy, it's cold, and it just clings to you. You're working in almost pitch black darkness, maybe with just one flickering, smoky lantern making everything look extra spooky and weird. Every splash, every squelch. Hey, it's all part of the job. This isn't some delicate, precise operation. It's tough, physical, back-breaking work. Shovel, lift, haul, empty, and then do it all over again. And these pits? They're not always conveniently located out in the open. Oh no. Sometimes, you're carrying those brimming buckets right through people's houses, tiptoeing past sleeping families, praying you don't spill a single precious drop. Talk about an awkward house call, right? Sometimes, mixed in with the usual deposits, you'd find other stuff. A lost coin. Score! That's a lucky day. Maybe a kid's toy. Or, and this is pretty grim, sometimes you'd find things that people tried to hide. Secrets the medieval town didn't want anyone to know about. So you basically became an accidental archaeologist of the city's gross underbelly, digging up stories that were definitely not for polite conversation. And if you happened to work for a castle, those huge stone fortresses often had these things called garderobes. Basically, toilets that just dropped everything straight down the outside wall, or into the moat. Super handy for the lords and ladies, not so much for you, especially if it got blocked up. And get this, sometimes, if the castle was under attack, an enemy soldier might actually try to sneak in through that very privy chute. Can you guess who got the lovely job of dealing with that particular, and probably very angry, blockage? Yep, suddenly, you're not just a gong farmer, you're on the front line of castle defense, armed with a shovel and a seriously strong stomach. What a job. The dangers, oh boy, the dangers were super real. Those fumes we were talking about? Not just stinky, they were deadly. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, no oxygen. Lots of poor gong farmers, maybe feeling a bit dizzy, but trying to push through. Well, they just never came back up. Suffocating down there was a constant, invisible threat. And the pit itself? It could just collapse on you. Rotten old timbers, crumbling stone walls, like what happened to poor Richard the Raker back in 1326. He fell into a cesspit when it caved in and actually drowned in, well, you know, in his work. What a truly awful way to go. And getting sick? You're basically swimming in germs. Skin infections, nasty eye infections, lung problems. Every little cut or scrape was like an open invitation for something awful to get in. Now, for all this never-ending festival of filth and fear, you'd probably think the pay was terrible, right? But here's a funny twist. It often wasn't bad at all. Gong farmers could actually earn a pretty decent wage, sometimes even more than skilled craftsmen. Like 2 shillings for a whole ton of waste back in the late 15th century? That was good money. Even Queen Elizabeth's own gong farmers at Hampton Court Palace were getting 6 pence a day. Not too shabby. Sometimes you even got paid in stuff instead of cash, like really good beeswax candles. Society needed this job done, no matter how gross, and they were willing to cough up the dough for it, even if they had to hold their noses while they paid you. But all the silver pennies in the world couldn't buy you popularity, that's for sure. Gong farmers were totally shunned. Outcasts, plain and simple. You had to live on the edge of town, literally. People would cross the street just to avoid walking past you. Your kids probably got teased all the time, and trying to find someone to marry who wasn't in another equally smelly line of work? Super tricky, that smell. It was like an invisible fence around your life. And if you dared to try and cheat the system, like dump your cartload in the wrong spot just to save yourself some time, oh, they'd make a huge example out of you. There was this one poor guy in London who got caught doing exactly that. His punishment? They put him inside one of his own barrels, filled it right up to his neck with, well, gong, and then paraded him through the streets for everyone to see. Talk about a stinky, public shaming. That was a pretty strong message to everyone else. Do your job right. As the very first faint glow of dawn started to light up the sky, your long night was almost over. But not quite. Now, you had to drag that super heavy, sloshing cart, groaning under its load of night soil, all the way out of town. 2 of the official dumps, called lay stalls, which were always carefully placed downwind from everybody else. Or sometimes, especially in big cities, it would get loaded onto barges and floated down the river to be sold as fertilizer for the farms. From privy to plow, a pretty smelly, but actually kinda smart way to recycle back then. And so, as the sun finally pops up, and the town slowly starts to wake up, hopefully to air that's just a little bit fresher, your night as a gong farmer is officially done. You're totally wiped out. Every muscle aches. You absolutely reek. And you're dreaming of a bath that feels like it could peel off your skin, in a good way. But hey, you did it. You faced the darkness. You battled the filth. Now get some sleep if you can. And try your best to dream of anything. Anything at all, other than the lovely job that's waiting for you all over again as soon as night falls. Okay, so maybe being a gong farmer, or master of the midnight muck, wasn't quite your cup of tea or a bucket of, well, you know. Perhaps you're thinking, isn't there something a little less subterranean? A job with a bit more daylight, maybe? Something that doesn't involve quite so much? Direct contact with the town's deepest secrets? Be careful what you wish for, my friend, because now, congratulations, you are a fuller, and your world is about to get very, very damp and uniquely fragrant in its own special way. Sounds kind of wholesome, doesn't it? Fuller, like someone who makes things full and fluffy, like you're plumping pillows or stuffing teddy bears. Not quite, but you are making wool full, that's true. But the process? Oh, it's less about gentle fluffing, and more about a pretty aggressive, super smelly, and honestly kinda bizarre ritual that involves a whole lot of human, well, let's just call them locally sourced liquid assets. And a lot of stomping. So let's set the scene. You're working in a bustling medieval town, probably one that's famous for its cloth trade. Think Flanders, or parts of England where sheep dotted every hillside like fluffy four-legged clouds. Wool, my friends, was big business. It was like medieval oil, a massive source of wealth and employment. And you, dear Fuller, you're a vital cog in this giant, woolly machine. A very important, if seriously pungent cog. Your workshop? It's definitely not some cute, picturesque weaver's cottage with roses round the door. Oh no, think damp. Think steamy. Think smelly. Unbelievably eye-wateringly smelly. You're surrounded by these huge wooden vats or long troughs, often sunk right into the damp earthen floor to keep them stable and, well, out of the way. The air in here is thick. Like, you could cut it with a knife thick. It's a potent cocktail of sharp, biting ammonia. That's our star ingredient, urine, doing its thing, mixed with the equally distinct, heavy, almost greasy scent of wet wool, and the general pervasive dampness that just seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. This isn't the gentle, lanolin smell of a freshly shorn fleece, or a cozy wool jumper. Nope, this is an industrial strength aroma that announces your profession from 50 paces. You'd probably see your workshop before you smelled it, with steam billowing from the doorway, especially on a cold day, making it look like some kind of strange alchemical laboratory. Inside, the light would be dim, maybe a few sputtering tallow candles or oil lamps casting flickering shadows on the damp stone or wooden walls, which themselves would be stained and probably growing interesting varieties of moss and lichen in the corners. So what exactly does a fuller do all day? Your main job is to take newly woven woolen cloth, which at this stage is pretty rough, still oily from the sheep's natural lanolin, which is great for the sheep, not so great for making clothes, and a bit loose and flimsy in its weave, and totally transform it. You're going to clean it, shrink it, and felt it. This makes the cloth thicker, softer, denser, and way more durable. It's the difference between a scratchy, shapeless bit of fabric and a proper, warm, weather-resistant material that can be made into tunics, cloaks, blankets, all the stuff that kept medieval folks from freezing their whatsits off. This whole process is called fulling, or sometimes walking the cloth. And you're about to find out why walking is a very, very appropriate term. Your main tools for this magical transformation? Your own 2 feet. Yep, you heard me right. For hours upon endless hours, you, and maybe a few of your fellow fullers if it's a busy workshop, will be standing in these vats, stomping, treading, kicking, and generally pummeling the heck out of that wool. All of this happens in a mixture that can only be described as uniquely medieval and highly organic. And what's in this charming, soupy mixture you're paddling in? The star ingredient, the one that gives your workshop its signature, unforgettable perfume, is stale urine. Yes, indeed. Good old human pee. Collected diligently from households all over town. Maybe there were designated collection pots left out on street corners. Or perhaps enterprising kids earned a few pennies by going door to door with buckets. Some monasteries, with their large communities, were apparently excellent and reliable sources of this valuable liquid. Why urine, you ask, with that slightly horrified look on your face? Well, as urine decomposes, it produces ammonia. And ammonia, my friends, is a fantastic natural detergent and degreaser. It's brilliant at stripping away all those natural oils, the dirt, the grime, and any other random bits and pieces that might be embedded in the raw wool. It's nature's own heavy-duty cleaner, free for the taking. Mostly. Isn't history just endlessly fascinating and slightly gross? So there you are, knee-deep, maybe even thigh-deep, if it's a particularly big batch of cloth, in a lukewarm, or, if you're unlucky and it's winter, an absolutely bone-chillingly cold bath of stale urine and heavy, sodden wool. You're stomping rhythmically, pressing down with your heels, kicking out with your toes, turning the massive, slippery bundle of cloth with your feet to make sure every single fiber gets the full treatment. It's a kind of dance, really. A very smelly, very repetitive, very unglamorous, and incredibly tiring dance. The aim is to pound all that dirt and grease out, and also, crucially, to make the individual wool fibers interlock and mat together. That's the felting process, and it's what gives the cloth its density and strength. You'd probably develop some seriously strong leg muscles doing this all day, every day. Sometimes, instead of or alongside the urine, you might use something called fuller's earth. This is a special kind of clay, usually a pale gray or greenish color, that's incredibly absorbent. It's great at soaking up oils and impurities, kind of like a medieval face mask for fabric. So depending on the recipe of the day, you could be stomping around in a delightful squishy slurry of clay, urine, and wool. Imagine the texture between your toes. Lovely. Some historical accounts even suggest that sheep droppings were occasionally added to the mix for reasons best known to medieval ingenuity and probably not worth dwelling on for too long. Let's just say they used what they had, and they weren't squeamish about it. This isn't a quick 5-minute job, by the way. Oh no. A single piece of cloth, which could be many yards long and incredibly heavy when wet, could take hours, many hours, sometimes even a full day or more, of this relentless trampling to get it just right. Archaeological digs, like some in places such as Eindhoven in the Netherlands, have actually unearthed the remains of these fulling pits. Some even show evidence of wicker linings, which might have been there to protect the cloth from snagging on rough stone, or maybe just to give the poor fuller something slightly less slimy and more textured to brace their feet against as they stomped. Imagine the state of your feet and legs after a day of this. The skin would be raw, red, and probably painfully irritated from the constant friction and the caustic solution. You'd be prone to all sorts of nasty infections, rashes, and fungal growths between your toes. And the smell, it wouldn't just be in the workshop. It would be on you. Deeply embedded in your skin, your hair, your rough woolen clothes, which were probably also fulled, just to complete the wonderfully aromatic irony. You were a walking, talking advertisement for the ammonia industry. Think about your social life for a second. You thought the gong farmer had it tough attracting dinner party invitations? At least his main work was done at night. You, the fuller, carry your unique professional perfume with you into the bright daylight hours. A trip to the market for some bread? People might suddenly find urgent business on the other side of the street. A visit to the local tavern for a well-earned and desperately needed ale after a hard day's stomp? You might find yourself with a suspiciously large amount of personal space at the bar. Your family, bless their tolerant hearts, probably just got used to it. Or maybe they kept a lot of windows open, even in the depths of winter, and burned a lot of incense, if they could afford it. Oh, that's just Dad, Mum home from the fulling mill. And it wasn't just the smell or the interesting ingredients. The work itself was incredibly physically demanding. Wool is heavy. Wet wool is unbelievably, back-breakingly heavy. You're constantly shifting its weight with your legs and feet, trying to ensure every part of the fabric gets thoroughly pounded and exposed to the cleaning solution. Your back would ache constantly. Your leg muscles would burn with a fiery passion. Your joints, knees, hips, ankles, would probably protest loudly with every stomp by the end of the day, and even more loudly when you tried to get out of your straw bed the next morning. It was a young person's game, mostly, or at least it took a serious toll on older bodies. Arthritis and rheumatism were likely common occupational hazards for career fullers. Once the stomping and sloshing part was finally done, when the master fuller, or you yourself if you were experienced enough, deemed the wool sufficiently clean and felted to the right consistency, it had to be rinsed. Thoroughly. And this wasn't a gentle rinse cycle. This meant hauling the incredibly heavy, sodden, and still rather fragrant mass of cloth out of the vats. This itself was a monumental effort, probably requiring 2 or more strong people. Then, it had to be taken to a nearby stream or river if your workshop wasn't already conveniently, and probably strategically, located right next to one. There, you'd be back in the water, this time hopefully cleaner water, beating and swishing the cloth against the current to wash out all the fulling agents and any remaining dirt. This, of course, introduced its own set of environmental delights for the local ecosystem, as the river would regularly receive its dose of secondhand urine, clay, and sheep grease. The fish probably weren't thrilled, and anyone drawing their drinking water downstream might have had a few choice words to say too. After rinsing, the cloth, now beautifully clean-ish and nicely felted, was stretched taut on these huge wooden frames called tenter frames. These frames were lined with rows of tenter hooks, small, sharp, L-shaped metal hooks that gripped the edges of the cloth. This is where we get that wonderfully descriptive phrase, to be on tenterhooks, meaning to be in a state of suspense or anxiety. Though for the cloth, it was more a state of being aggressively and uncomfortably stretched. This stretching process was super important. It helped the cloth to dry evenly, prevented it from shrinking uncontrollably as it dried, and ensured it met the required dimensions and didn't end up all wonky. Rows and rows of these tenter frames, with their colorful bolts of drying cloth flapping gently in the breeze, would have been a common and quite picturesque sight in the fields or open spaces around cloth-producing towns. It was probably the only visually appealing part of the whole fulling business, and even then your job as a fuller might not be entirely done. Sometimes after drying, the cloth would then need to be teased, This involved brushing the surface of the wool with thistles, specifically the dried flower heads of the teasel plant, which have naturally stiff, hook-like bracts. This process raised the nap of the wool, making it feel even softer and fluffier. And then, just to make it perfect, it might go to a specialist shearer or cloth finisher who would carefully trim that raised nap with enormous razor-sharp shears to give it a perfectly uniform, smooth, almost velvety surface. It was a multi-stage, highly skilled process, and your part, the fulling, was one of the roughest, most elemental, and definitely smelliest stages of it all. Later on in the Middle Ages, and becoming more common in the centuries that followed, technology started to lend a hand, or rather a series of giant, water-powered hammers. Fulling mills began to appear, especially in areas with fast-flowing rivers. These were pretty ingenious contraptions. A water wheel, turned by the river's current, would power a camshaft. This camshaft had projecting cams, or tappets, that would lift and then release large, heavy wooden hammers or stocks. These hammers would then fall rhythmically and powerfully into troughs filled with the cloth and the fulling solution, pounding and kneading the fabric much more efficiently and with far greater force than human feet ever could. This was a game changer. It didn't entirely eliminate the human element, of course. Someone still had to load and unload the cloth, manage the vats, keep the machinery maintained, which was a whole new set of skills and dangers, and oversee the whole process. But it did significantly reduce the sheer physical drudgery of kamek, endless, exhausting stomping for many. However, these mills required a big financial investment to build and maintain, and you needed reliable access to flowing water. So the old, traditional, foot-powered method of fulling persisted in many smaller workshops and less industrialized areas for a long, long time. You can bet there were some fullers who were thrilled to see the mills arrive, and probably some who worried about their jobs. The fuller, despite the humble, arduous, and incredibly odorous nature of his or her work, played an absolutely critical role in the medieval economy. Without properly fulled cloth, the garments made would be rough, weak, prone to shrinking, and wouldn't last nearly as long. Good quality woolen cloth was a hugely valuable commodity, the backbone of England's wealth for centuries, traded far and wide across Europe. So you, the fuller, reeking of your trade, were an essential artisan. Your skill, knowing just how long to stomp, what consistency the fulling mixture should be, how to handle the delicate wool without tearing it, judging the right amount of felting for different types of fabric, was crucial. One misstep, one batch of cloth fulled for too long or not long enough, and a valuable piece of merchandise could be ruined, costing your employer, or yourself if you were independent, a lot of money. Imagine the quiet, perhaps slightly smelly pride, though, when you saw someone walking down the street in a fine woolen tunic or a warm, sturdy cloak. Knowing that its softness, its density, its ability to keep out the biting wind and chilling rain was partly due to your hours upon hours of thankless, exhausting, and uniquely fragrant toil. Perhaps that was some small consolation as you trudged home at the end of another long day, your legs aching like mad, your clothes still damp and carrying that unmistakable aroma of your profession, a walking, stomping testament to the strange alchemy that turned raw, greasy fleece and buckets of stale urine into medieval England's greatest export. It was a job that definitely required a strong stomach, even stronger legs, and probably a permanently desensitized sense of smell. It was awkward, it was arduous, it was eye-wateringly pungent, but the rhythmic, squelching stomp of the fuller's feet was, in many ways, the very heartbeat of the medieval textile industry, a mucky, ammonia-laden, but utterly vital pulse in the life of the town. Sleep well, you master of the muck and mire, you champion of clean-ish cloth, waiting for wrigglers, the leech collector's itchy harvest. Ah, medieval medicine, a fascinating and often frightening landscape of humors, miasmas, herbal concoctions, and leeches. Yes, those slippery, segment-bodied, blood-sucking little aquatic critters, Hirudo medicinalis being the most prized species, were a veritable cornerstone of healing practices for centuries, a tradition stretching all the way back to the learned physicians of ancient Greece and the mysterious priest healers of Egypt. and gaining particular traction and widespread application in Europe during the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was the height of medical fashion, a near-universal treatment believed to cure almost everything imaginable, from a raging fever to a melancholic disposition, a throbbing headache to a broken heartache, a troublesome cough to a mysterious ague. The underlying theory was the need to balance the body's four essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess or deficiency in any of these was thought to cause illness, and letting out a bit of bad or excess blood was the go-to remedy. And who, or what better to assist in this delicate, if often messy, art of venesection than the humble, unassuming, yet remarkably efficient leech? But where, you might wonder, did these invaluable medicinal marvels actually come from? They didn't just magically appear, neatly arranged, on the apothecary's polished shelf, or swim contentedly in the barber surgeon's glass jar by some arcane enchantment. Oh no. Someone, some hardy and often overlooked individual, had to venture out into the wild and collect them. And tonight, dear listener, that someone is you. You are a leech collector, a purveyor of these vital wriggling tools of the medical trade. Your office, not a cozy, well-lit shop, nor a dry, scholarly study. Your workplace was the wild, wet, and often murky, forgotten places of the landscape. The squelchy bogs, the stagnant, reed-choked marshes, the muddy, slow-moving ponds, and the reedy, overgrown riverbanks that crisscross the countryside of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and indeed, much of Europe. These were places where the air hung thick and heavy, with the incessant, high-pitched buzz of mosquitoes and other biting insects, the guttural, rhythmic croaking of unseen frogs, and the pervasive, damp, earthy smell of decaying vegetation and stagnant water, a far cry from the perfumed chambers of the wealthy patients who would ultimately benefit from your harvest. Now, how does one actually go about catching the leech? With a tiny, delicate net, perhaps? Or a carefully baited miniature hook and line? Don't be so modern, so gentle. The most common method, the most direct, the most effective, and certainly the most awkward method, was to employ your own vulnerable flesh, specifically your legs, as living, irresistible bait. You'd roll up your rough spun breeches, or hike up your woolen skirts, and wade slowly, deliberately, into the murky, often shockingly chilly, and invariably smelly water. Then, you'd swish your legs around a bit, splash gently, perhaps stir the muddy bottom with your bare feet, or a long, sturdy stick, anything to disturb the silt and attract the attention of those ever-hungry, blood-seeking little annelids. An 1814 depiction, quite famously, of leech finders in Yorkshire, shows women, their skirts hitched high, waiting patiently in a pond, one casually holding a long stick, presumably to stir the leeches from their hiding places amongst the reeds and understones. And then you wait, patiently, stoically, for that telltale slight tickle, that almost imperceptible pinch as a leech, sensing the warmth of your blood and the subtle vibrations of your movement through the water, latches on firmly with its powerful suckers, one at each end of its body. Imagine the distinct, unsettling feel of the cold, slimy mud oozing slowly between your toes, the sharp, scratchy reeds brushing against your bare, exposed skin, the constant, irritating hum of insects exploring every inch of you, and then the unnerving, creeping sensation of multiple small, cool, surprisingly strong creatures attaching themselves to your flesh, their tiny, almost invisible, Y-shaped jaws making nearly painless incisions as they begin their work. Soon, your legs, from ankle to thigh, might be adorned with a glistening, dark, writhing, and rather gruesome collection of them, a slimy mass of leeches, as one contemporary account vividly described it. This direct, personal use of one's own body as bait is perhaps the absolute peak of occupational awkwardness and inherent danger, speaking volumes about the desperation, the poverty, or perhaps the incredibly low social standing of those individuals who undertook such a peculiar and perilous form of work. Once a leech had drunk its fill of your blood, a process which could take anywhere from 20 minutes to a few hours, depending on the size and hunger of the leech, it would often detach itself and drop away. Or, if you were in a hurry or the leeches were particularly tenacious, you'd gently, or perhaps not so gently if time was pressing and the leeches were plentiful, pick them off your skin and pop them one by one into your collecting jar, a small wooden barrel with a secure lid, or a simple canvas bag slung over your shoulder. You had to be exceptionally careful during this removal process. Ripping them off too soon or too roughly might damage the leech, rendering it unsellable to the discerning apothecary, or worse, could leave its tiny, sharp teeth embedded in your skin, creating a perfect entry point for infection. Conversely, if you let them feast for too long, or if too many attached at once, well, the consequences of excessive blood loss could be dire for you. Sometimes, particularly if the collector was infirm or the demand for leeches was exceptionally high, old, worn-out horses or other livestock were driven into leech-infested waters to act as large-scale mobile bait, a rather grim and pitiable fate for these poor beasts, who were often left standing for hours, exhausted, bleeding profusely from dozens of bites, and covered head to hoof in a thick carpet of leeches. One particularly harrowing account describes these sacrificial horses being led into ponds, their legs and bellies soon completely covered with feasting leeches. They would then be let out, the leeches harvested, and the animals allowed to recover for a few days before becoming, quote, fresh victims once more. A cycle that continued until the horses became too weak and exhausted to even drag themselves out of the water, sometimes collapsing and drowning in the very ponds where they served as bait. Nets baited with raw animal liver or other bloody offal were also sometimes used, a less personal and perhaps less skin-crawling method, but generally considered less effective than live bait. The shift between using oneself, a valuable if expendable animal, or inanimate bait reflects a grim pragmatism, a constant weighing of human risk against the cost or availability of animal bait, and it certainly highlights a certain callousness towards animal welfare that was common, if not universal, in the period. This was certainly not a job for the faint of heart, or for those with thin blood or a delicate constitution. Leeches are remarkably efficient feeders, and even after they detach, the small Y-shaped wound, thanks to the potent anticoagulant hirudine present in their saliva, which prevents the blood from clotting, could continue to bleed, sometimes quite significantly, for up to 10 long hours. A successful day's collecting, with dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of leeches harvested, could easily leave you feeling lightheaded, profoundly weak, dizzy, and dangerously low on your own vital blood. And the risk of infection, in an era long before antibiotics or even a basic understanding of hygiene, was ever present and often deadly. Waiting for hours in stagnant, undoubtedly polluted, dirty water with multiple small, open, bleeding wounds on your legs, it's a perfect recipe for disaster. Leech collectors were frequently plagued by a host of ailments: ague, a type of fever, likely malaria, catarrh, inflammation of the mucous membranes, and rheumatism, their bodies worn down and made vulnerable by the constant exposure to damp, cold conditions and the chronic, debilitating blood loss. And let's not forget the other delightful inhabitants of the marshes and bogs: venomous snakes, swarms of biting insects, sharp submerged rocks, and who knows what other unseen perils lurked in those murky, treacherous waters, adding another layer of constant danger to your daily paddle for profit. By the 19th century, the demand for medicinal leeches had reached such a fever pitch, a veritable leech craze fueled by influential physicians like François-Joseph Victor Broussais in France, who advocated their liberal use for almost every conceivable ailment, that wild leech populations in many areas began to dwindle alarmingly. France alone, at the peak of this leech mania, imported an astonishing 33 million leeches in a single year. This insatiable demand meant that leech collectors had to roam further and further afield, from pond to pond, from moor to moor, as the poet William Wordsworth described in his famous poem Resolution and Independence, making the work even more wearisome, the journeys longer, and the precious leeches increasingly harder to find. This intense economic incentive for a very risky and deeply unpleasant job also led, inevitably, to significant ecological consequences, an early and stark example of unsustainable harvesting driven by prevailing medical fads and powerful market forces. Despite the considerable risks, the physical discomfort, and the uniquely intimate nature of your work, leech collectors were generally not well paid for their efforts. Wordsworth's memorable leech gatherer was described as old and poor, his employment hazardous and wearisome. Often, leech collectors were women, particularly Scottish women according to some 19th century accounts, or elderly men, individuals perhaps with few other viable means of earning a meager living in a harsh economic landscape. They were often solitary, somewhat mysterious figures, haunting the wild, forgotten places on the fringes of settled land. Imagine the sight. A lone figure, perhaps stripped nearly naked to maximize skin exposure to the leeches, or with their rough clothes hitched high above their knees, wading slowly and methodically through a desolate bog, their legs a living canvas for a multitude of hungry, feasting leeches. One French medical publication from the era described a typical leech collector as having a woe-begone aspect, his hollow eyes, his livid lips, his singular gestures, making him easily mistaken for a maniac by any uninitiated observer. This perception, born directly from the unusual nature of their work and the often gaunt, blood-drained appearance it dictated, likely contributed to a significant degree of social marginalization, setting them apart from the rest of the community, figures both necessary and vaguely unsettling. And what of the patient, anxiously awaiting these carefully and painfully collected creatures? The experience for them was also, undoubtedly, rather awkward and often uncomfortable. Leeches were applied with enthusiasm to almost every conceivable part of the human body, inside the nostrils, on the inside of the lower lip, on the chest, and on the side, sometimes by 4 at a time. For various female conditions, it was not uncommon for physicians to prescribe the application of 3 to 6 leeches on the cervix. A narrow glass tube, known as a leech glass, was sometimes used to affix the leeches more precisely inside the mouth or other sensitive body cavities, occasionally with a fine thread tied to the leech's tail as a rather alarming precaution against accidental swallowing by the patient. Awkward for the patient, most certainly, but it was you, dear leech collector, who braved the bogs and sacrificed your own blood to make this peculiar and, at the time, indispensable form of healing possible. So, as your collecting bag or glass jar slowly fills with your wriggling, blood-gorged, and surprisingly valuable harvest, and your own legs feel a bit tingly, damp, and perhaps uncomfortably light, you can finally head back towards the town or village, perhaps to sell your precious wares directly to the local apothecary, the barber surgeon, or even a traveling physician. You've braved the bogs, you've endured the bites, you've offered yourself as a living feast, all in the name of medieval and early modern medicine. Rest now, perhaps with your feet elevated and a good, thick, clean bandage wrapped around those numerous, itchy, Y-shaped bite marks that are the unmistakable signature of your unique and arduous trade. After all, tomorrow, the leeches in the ponds will be hungry again, and the doctors and apothecaries of the town will undoubtedly be calling for a fresh supply. Snips, saws, and shaves. The barber surgeon's close shave with disaster. Feeling a bit off-color in the Middle Ages? Perhaps you've developed a raging, throbbing toothache that makes you want to chew on hard rocks just for a moment's relief from the agony. Or maybe you're in need of a sharp, fashionable haircut to impress the merchants at the market, or to look your best at the upcoming village festival, or perhaps, far more grimly, an unfortunate limb, mangled in a jousting tournament gone terribly awry, or crushed in a farm accident involving a runaway cart and a poorly secured load, needs urgent, life-saving removing. You wouldn't necessarily seek out a university-trained physician for all of these diverse and often urgent needs. Oh no. Those learned, Latin-spouting doctors, who often considered the messy, hands-on practice of surgery to be far beneath their esteemed dignity, were generally little concerned with the common folks' everyday medical complaints, and certainly not with the prospect of getting their own manicured hands dirty with blood and grime. For many of these distinctly hands-on and often rather alarming procedures, you'd pay a visit to your local, multi-talented, and perhaps slightly terrifying barber surgeon. And tonight, dear listener, you are that indispensable, jack-of-all-trades and occasionally blood-spattered individual. One part skilled hairdresser, one part, well, rudimentary body mechanic, deftly bridging the often disparate worlds of personal grooming and primitive, practical medicine. Your shop, it's not quite the serene, perfumed salon of modern times, nor is it the gleaming, sterile clinic we'd expect for medical procedures. It's a bustling, often chaotic, and invariably aromatic place. In a larger, more established barber-surgeon shop, on one side, perhaps a customer is getting a neat, precise shave with a well-honed razor or a stylish trim to their beard, the air pleasantly scented with herbal tonics, rosemary water, or lavender used to perfume the shaving soaps and hair preparations. On the other side of the room, well, that's where things tend to get a bit more visceral, a bit more medieval. The air in this section might be a strange, unsettling, and altogether more pungent mix. The clean scent of soap and rosemary water for hair treatments, mingling uncomfortably with the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. The slightly vinegary, fermented smell of wine, often used as a rudimentary, though largely ineffective, antiseptic on open wounds. And perhaps, on a busy surgical day, the faint, acrid, singed aroma emanating from a recently used cauterizing iron, employed to sear bleeding stumps. The sounds of your establishment? The rhythmic, precise snip, snip, snip of sharp scissors trimming hair. The methodical scrape of a keen razor against a stubbled chin, punctuated, rather alarmingly, by the occasional sudden yelp of pain, a muffled groan, or a full-throated scream from the surgical corner of the shop, or even more disturbingly, the grating, rhythmic zzzzzzzzs of a bone saw making its way through limb. Imagine the scene, a common one in your daily life. You're halfway through giving Lord Reginald a fashionable new layered haircut, carefully shaping his locks to match the latest courtly style, when a breathless, frantic peasant rushes in through your shop door, clutching a horribly mangled arm, the result of a dreadful mishap with a freshly sharpened scythe during the harvest. "Just a moment, my lord. Urgent duty calls," you'd likely say, hastily wiping your razor on your apron and quickly swapping your fine-tooth comb for a rather more formidable and blood-stained saw. The medieval equivalent of a very, very abruptly interrupted haircut, and a stark illustration of your dual responsibilities. This constant, jarring juxtaposition of the mundane and the critical, the cosmetic and the potentially life-threatening, all happening concurrently within the same small, shared space, would have created countless, inherently awkward, stressful, and probably quite unsettling situations for both you, the practitioner, and your diverse clientele. Patients waiting nervously for a painful tooth to be pulled might be sitting directly adjacent to someone calmly enjoying a shave and a bit of town gossip. The distinct sounds, smells, and anxieties of each procedure inevitably drifting across the room and mingling uncomfortably. The barbering aspect of your trade was your daily bread and butter, the reliable foundation of your income. Cutting hair for men, women, and children, providing clean shaves for the gentry and merchants, perhaps even expertly styling a fancy waxed mustache for the local alderman, or carefully trimming the circular tonsures of monks from the nearby monastery. But the surgical side, that was where the true, undeniable awkwardness, the significant danger, and the often grim reality of medieval life truly lay. Bloodletting was a classic, almost ubiquitous procedure, performed for nearly any ailment imaginable, from a common cold to a fit of melancholy. Feeling unwell, aches and pains, a general sense of malaise. Clearly, your vital humors were out of balance, likely due to an excess of bad blood or corrupted humors that needed to be released. Out would come your sharp, polished lancet to deftly puncture a prominent vein, usually in the arm. Or you'd apply a selection of hungry leeches, which you probably acquired from our good friend the leech collector after some haggling over price and quality. Or, for a more vigorous effect, you might use heated glass cups to create suction on the skin, drawing blood to the surface in a practice known as cupping. You'd make a swift, practiced incision and let the dark blood flow, all in the name of restoring that tricky, delicate internal equilibrium that was believed to govern health. Got a painfully rotten, abscessed tooth? There was no delicate, refined dentistry to be found here, no gentle drilling or careful fillings. You were the designated tooth drawer, the local expert in dental extraction. Armed with a fearsome-looking array of iron forceps, often crudely made and roughly finished by the local blacksmith, you'd get a firm, unwavering grip on that troublesome molar and, with a grunt and a powerful yank, pull it from its socket. All this, most likely, with the patient wide awake, their eyes wide with apprehension, their knuckles white as they grip the arms of your sturdy wooden chair, and very, very vocal about their considerable discomfort. There was no anesthesia to speak of, remember? Maybe a very strong swig of ale or potent wine beforehand for courage, for both you and the patient. Or perhaps, for a particularly resistant or terrified patient, they would be firmly held down by strong assistants or even family members during the brief but brutal procedure. Amputations were a grim, last resort necessity for severe, life-threatening injuries, such as a badly crushed limb from a car accident, a deeply infected wound that refused to heal, or the relentless, creeping blackness of gangrene. This was certainly not a procedure for the squeamish, neither for the patient nor the practitioner. Using your collection of sharp knives and sturdy bone saws, often unsterilized beyond a cursory wipe on a cloth or a quick pass through a flame, as the concept of sterilization through heat was not yet understood as a preventative measure against infection. You'd perform the amputation. Speed was absolutely of the essence to minimize the terrifying blood loss, to reduce the shock to the patient's system, and, well, to lessen the duration of the inevitable agonizing screaming. Cautery. The practice of searing the bleeding stump of the amputated limb with a red-hot iron, heated in your forge until it glowed, was the common, if brutal method, used to seal the severed blood vessels and attempt to stop the profuse bleeding. The acrid, sickening smell of burning flesh, another delightful and utterly unforgettable addition to your workshop's already unique and complex aromatic profile, a scent that would linger long after the procedure was complete. The sheer, unmitigated brutality of such procedures, performed without any effective pain relief or a proper understanding of infection control, is a major source of what we, from our modern vantage point, would consider the profound awkwardness and horror of the job. You, the barber surgeon, were the direct inflictor of this immense, unavoidable pain, even if your ultimate intention was to save a life. This must have created a deeply complex ethical, emotional, and psychological space for you to navigate daily. Lancing boils, carbuncles, and abscesses was another frequent and necessary task. Those painful, inflamed, pus-filled swellings that could make life a misery for the sufferer, you'd be the one to decisively pop them. A quick, sharp, decisive slice with a clean scalpel, and hopefully a rush of relief for the patient, inevitably mixed with a fair bit of unpleasant, often foul-smelling discharge. And if someone unfortunate broke an arm from falling off a restless horse or tumbled awkwardly down a flight of steep, uneven stairs, you do your very best to realign the fractured bones by careful touch and practiced feel, then bind them tightly and immobilize them with wooden splints and strong linen bandages. Your toolkit was diverse, to say the very least, reflecting your multifaceted role. Razors of varying sharpness, fine scissors, combs made of wood or bone, and brushes for the hair and beard grooming services. And for the other, less cosmetic side of your business, sharp, pointed lancets for bloodletting, sturdy iron forceps for tooth pulling, robust bone saws for amputations, keen-edged scalpels for making incisions, and a selection of cauterizing irons of different shapes and sizes to sear wounds and stop bleeding. These instruments were typically fashioned from iron or steel by local smiths, and as previously mentioned, cleaning practices were rudimentary at best, often consisting of little more than wiping them on a cloth or rinsing them in water, with no real concept of sterility. The iconic red and white striped pole often seen outside your shop, a vivid, instantly recognizable, and rather stark symbol of your trade. The red representing the blood of surgery, the white representing the bandages used to dress wounds. A rather graphic, if effective, advertisement for your varied and often gory talents. The risks involved in your procedures were considerable, especially, of course, for the unfortunate patient. Infection was a massive, pervasive, and often fatal risk. Without any understanding of germ theory or antiseptic practices, wounds frequently festered, leading to sepsis, gangrene, and death. Many people, tragically, died not from the original ailment or the injury itself, but from the severe complications that arose after your well-intentioned but often unsterile intervention. Overbleeding during enthusiastic bloodletting procedures was also a common and unfortunate way to accidentally hasten a patient's demise rather than cure their ills. For you, the barber surgeon, while not explicitly detailed in these sources as a high-risk job for personally catching diseases directly from patients, though constant exposure to blood and bodily fluids must have posed some threat, the psychological toll must have been immense. The burden of regularly inflicting such intense pain, even in the pursuit of healing. The constant stress of performing life-or-death procedures with limited tools, incomplete knowledge, and often unpredictable outcomes, and the ever-present potential for blame or even retribution from grieving families if things went tragically wrong, would have been a heavy and relentless weight to bear. You occupied a precarious and often contradictory position in medieval society. You were undeniably essential, especially in smaller towns or rural areas where university-trained physicians were scarce, prohibitively expensive, or simply unwilling to perform manual surgical tasks. Yet, your methods were, by necessity, often brutal, the pain inflicted intense, and the outcomes highly uncertain. This could lead to a complex and fluctuating reputation. Sometimes you were respected and valued for your practical skills, your courage, and your willingness to undertake difficult and unpleasant tasks that others shied away from. Other times, you might be feared, distrusted, or blamed for poor outcomes, or the inevitable suffering your treatments caused. Your social standing was, therefore, a somewhat mixed and evolving bag. Initially, in the earlier medieval period, you might have been considered a lower status craftsman, someone who performed manual labor and dealt with the human body in a very hands-on, and sometimes unpleasantly bloody way, placing you below the esteemed, university-educated physicians. However, as your practical skills became more demonstrably necessary and valued, especially in times of war, where you'd be an indispensable presence on the front lines, treating gruesome battle wounds with speed and pragmatism, or during devastating outbreaks of plague, where you might be involved in the dangerous tasks of quarantine enforcement, lancing plague boils, and caring for the sick and dying. Your status could, and often did, rise. Some particularly skilled, fortunate, or well-connected barber surgeons even attained considerable wealth, respect, and prominence within their communities. You were, at the very least, an accessible and familiar figure in daily life. Everyone needed a haircut eventually, and many, if not most, would, at some unfortunate point in their lives, require your other, less pleasant, but often life-saving services too. Guilds of barber surgeons eventually formed in many towns and cities, attempting to regulate the trade, oversee the lengthy apprenticeships required to learn the dual crafts, and maintain certain standards of practice and ethics, further enhancing the profession's standing over time. So after a long, demanding day of snipping hair, shaving beards, lancing boils, pulling teeth, and perhaps sawing off a limb or two, you can finally hang up your inevitably blood-stained apron and wash the day's grime from your hands. You trim the beards of the local gentry, and perhaps more grimly, trim the limbs of the less fortunate, all in a typical day's work. Rest now, if your conscience and your weary body allow, and let's sincerely hope your dreams aren't filled with the unsettling sound of, well, a dull bone saw grating through bone, or the sharp, sickening sizzle of a red-hot cauterizing iron meeting raw flesh. Because tomorrow, there's always another fashionable haircut to give, or another painfully festering boil to lance, or another desperate soul needing your unique, if formidable, skills. Such is the varied, vital, and often visceral life of a medieval barber surgeon, the hangman's hood and the knacker's knife, dealing in death and discarded things. Okay, so we've navigated some pretty intense career paths already, right? From the depths of the cesspit to the questionable remedies of the leech collector and the barber surgeon. But now we're heading into even darker territory. A place where life officially ends, and where society's biggest outcasts do its dirtiest, most necessary, and most feared work. Tonight, dear listener, you are the executioner. Yep. And if that wasn't enough to make you the least popular guy at the village fair, chances are pretty high. Your job description also included being the local knacker. A real 2-for-1 deal in waste management, let's call it. Think about it. One job deals with the messy end of human life, as ordered by the law. The other one? It deals with the messy end of animal life, the ones that don't make it to the butcher's block. Both jobs are absolutely steeped in blood, in death, and in a kind of social awkwardness so profound it's almost a superpower. It's a super grim package deal, for sure. But in that weird medieval way of thinking, it actually made a certain kind of twisted sense. Who else but the fella, already stained by the public taking of human life, would be willing, or desperate enough, to handle the filth, the gore, and the disease of dead and dying animals? It's like, well, you're already over there on the social ladder, might as well handle this too. Let's start with your main gig, executioner. This isn't a job you just stumble into after scrolling through medieval LinkedIn, okay? More likely, it's a role you inherited. Like, congrats son, the family business of beheading and hanging is all yours now. A real charming family legacy, passed down like a cursed axe. Or maybe, just maybe, through some incredibly desperate circumstances, you were forced to take it up. Because, let's be super clear, this was not a popular career choice. Not by a long shot. As the official guy in charge of carrying out justice, or, what passed for it back then, you were a super important part of the legal system. Can't have laws without someone to enforce the pointy end of them, right? Yet, at the same time, you were a total pariah, an outcast. You lived on the very fringes of society, and I mean that literally. Your little hut or cottage was probably way outside the town walls, or tucked away in some nasty, undesirable part of town that nobody else wanted. People would totally avoid you. They'd cross the street if they saw you coming. Kids would whisper your name like you were the boogeyman and point. You might even be banned from walking into the church through the main door, if you were allowed in at all. Maybe they'd stick you in a special sinner's seat at the very back, far away from all the good, respectable folks. Your touch? Considered defiling. Your very presence? A bad omen. Rough crowd. Your main duties, of course, were to carry out the sentences that the courts handed down. And medieval justice, let me tell you, had a certain flair for the dramatic and the downright cruel. Hangings were super common, especially for thieves and other criminals who weren't, high class enough for a nobler death. You'd be in charge of the whole setup. The gallows, making sure they were sturdy enough. Don't want any embarrassing accidents. The rope, testing its strength, and making sure the noose was tied just right. Though, just right, back then often meant a slow, agonizing strangulation, rather than a quick, clean neck snap like you see in the movies. Ugh. The crowd would gather, sometimes in a festive mood. Medieval entertainment was weird, guys, for the grim public show. And you'd be the one leading the condemned person up the steps, maybe listening to their last desperate words, or perhaps just getting on with it. Then you'd release the trap door, or kick away the ladder, the sight of a body twitching and struggling at the end of a rope. Yeah, that was your handiwork. Your responsibility. How'd you sleep at night? Beheadings were often kept for the fancier folks, the nobles and aristocrats. It was considered a more honorable and quicker way to go. But, and this is a big but, it demanded some serious skill from you, the executioner. A clean, single strike, with a super heavy axe, or a specialized, two-handed executioner's sword was the goal. If you messed it up, if it took multiple gruesome swings to get the job done, well, that was horrific for the person on the block, obviously, but it could also make the crowd turn really, really nasty and hostile towards you. You needed incredibly steady hands, a strong arm, nerves of actual steel, and a good eye, especially if the victim was someone important or well-known. The thud of the head falling into the sawdust-filled basket, the sudden, shocking spurt of blood, just another day at your very awkward office. You probably hoped for a strong neck that day. Then there was burning at the stake. This was the particularly agonizing end, reserved for people accused of heresy. That's like going against the official church teachings. Witchcraft. And sometimes for those convicted of really serious treason. Your job here was to secure the poor soul to the stake, make sure the bundles of wood, called faggots, were piled up high and tight around them, and then set it all on fire. The smell of burning flesh, which is apparently unforgettable in the worst possible way, the screams of the victim, if they weren't lucky enough to suffocate from the smoke first, the intense, radiating heat of the flames. These were the sensory experiences that came with this part of your profession. You were literally stoking the fires of hell in the eyes of many, and if that wasn't bad enough, there was drawing and quartering. This was a truly barbaric and theatrical punishment, usually reserved for the absolute worst traitors to the crown. It was designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. The victim would typically be drawn, that is, dragged by a horse, often over rough ground, to the place of execution. Then, they'd be hanged until they were almost dead, but cut down while still alive. Then came the really awful part. They'd be disemboweled, their entrails often pulled out and burned right in front of their eyes. And finally, after all that, they'd be beheaded, and their body would be cut into 4 quarters. These quarters were often then displayed publicly, stuck on spikes over city gates or on London Bridge, for example, as a super chilling warning to anyone else thinking of committing treason. Your role in this gruesome multi-act play? Central. You were the master of ceremonies, the chief butcher, for these ultimate acts of state-sanctioned brutality. You needed a strong stomach and a certain detachment to get through that kind of day. But wait, there's more. Beyond these grand public displays of terminal justice, you were also often the official torturer. If the court needed a confession to seal a case, or if they wanted to extract some vital information from a reluctant prisoner, guess who they called? You. Your workshop probably included a delightful array of instruments designed to inflict maximum pain. The rack, for stretching people in very unnatural ways. Thumbscrews, ouch. The scavenger's daughter, a truly horrific A-frame contraption that compressed the body until blood might burst from the nose and ears, and branding irons for marking people permanently. The screams coming from the dungeon, the broken, trembling bodies you might return to their cells. This, too, was part of your job description. You were the keeper of the state's darkest secrets and its most brutal, persuasive instruments. Now, you usually had some kind of legal protection for all this. A warrant or an official order for your actions. You were, after all, just doing the state's bidding, an instrument of the law. Some executioners, believe it or not, even kept detailed diaries. Master Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, Germany, is a famous example from a slightly later period, 16th, 17th century, but his experiences and his writings give us a rare insight into the life and mindset of someone in this profession. His journals reveal a man who saw himself as a skilled craftsman, albeit one whose craft was death and punishment. He meticulously recorded every execution and every flogging he performed. He also, very interestingly, practiced medicine on the side, and was apparently quite good at it. This seems bizarre to us, but it wasn't unheard of. Executioners gained a pretty decent, if grim, understanding of human anatomy from their day job, and the hood? That classic image of the black-hooded executioner. Mostly a myth, or at least not standard practice everywhere. In smaller towns and communities, everybody knew darn well who the executioner was. There was no hiding it. The hood was perhaps used more for anonymity in very large cities, or when dealing with particularly high-profile or politically sensitive executions, where the authorities wanted to obscure the executioner's identity, maybe to protect them from reprisals from the victim's powerful friends or family. But usually, your identity was an open and probably much feared secret. Now, if all that wasn't enough to make you the absolute least popular person at any social gathering, let's add your other common job title to the mix, the knacker. As the local knacker, you were the one responsible for dealing with all the dead and dying animals in the area, the ones that weren't suitable for the butcher to sell as food. We're talking old, worn-out horses that had finally collapsed in the fields, cows that had succumbed to some mysterious illness, pigs that had died unexpectedly, even stray dogs that had met an unfortunate end. If it was an animal, and it was dead or very nearly dead, and not destined for the dinner table, it was your problem to sort out. Your knacker's yard, oh boy. This place would have been located well away from polite society, probably right next to your own isolated house, and maybe not too far from the gallows, just to keep all the unpleasantness in one convenient, out-of-the-way spot. The stench alone would have been legendary. Imagine piles of decaying animal carcasses in various states of dismemberment, buzzing with immense, thick clouds of flies, especially in the summer heat. The ground would be slick with gore and goodness knows what else. The air would be thick, almost unbreathable, with the overwhelming odors of rot, blood, offal, and the vats where you were rendering down fat. It would make the gong farmer's nightly rounds seem like a walk in a rose garden, by comparison. Your tasks here were many and varied, and all of them were pretty messy. First, you would have to collect the carcasses. This wasn't always easy. It might involve using a special sturdy cart, perhaps fitted with a winch or a crane, to haul heavy animals like horses or cattle from wherever they'd fallen. A farmer's field, a muddy town street, or even pulled from a river. Then came the processing. You'd skin the animals, because the hides were actually quite valuable. They'd be sold to tanners, another profession known for its rather potent smells, by the way. You'd render down the animal fat, boiling it in huge bubbling cauldrons to produce tallow. And tallow was super important back then. It was used for making cheap candles, the smoky, smelly, sputtering kind that most ordinary folks used, not the fancy, sweet-smelling beeswax ones the rich had. Tallow was also a key ingredient in making soap. So in a very roundabout and smelly way, you, the knacker, were actually contributing to providing light and a bit of cleanliness to the community, even as you toiled away in absolute filth. Bones were another valuable byproduct. They'd be boiled to extract any remaining marrow and grease, and then often ground down into bone meal, which was an excellent fertilizer for the fields. Hooves and horns could be boiled for hours and hours to produce glue, a vital adhesive in a world without superglue. And what about any meat that was still sort of salvageable? And salvageable is a very, very relative term here, okay? It certainly wasn't fit for most human consumption, but it might be sold off incredibly cheaply to the absolute poorest of the poor, those who were truly desperate and had no other options. Or, more commonly, it would be used as food for dogs, like the hounds used by nobles for hunting, or perhaps even for the terriers kept by your fellow awkward professional, the rat catcher. Absolutely no part of the animal went to waste if it could possibly be helped. A smelly, gory, but surprisingly resourceful and efficient operation. Absolutely vital for public sanitation, getting rid of rotting carcasses that could spread disease, and for the local economy, providing all those useful byproducts. Your tools for knackering were just as grim as your executioner's kit. Heavy-duty knives for skinning and butchering, cleavers for chopping through bone, sturdy saws, those large cauldrons for boiling and rendering, and an incredibly strong constitution. The work was incredibly physically demanding, unbelievably messy, and carried a very high risk of disease from handling infected animals. Cuts and scratches were just part of the job, and in this pre-antibiotic era, any little wound could easily turn septic and deadly. The social stigma attached to being a knacker was almost as profound, if not quite as terrifying, as that of being an executioner. You dealt with death, with decay, with disease. People truly believed that the foul smells coming from your yard, that good old miasma theory again, could actually cause illness and spread pestilence. You were seen as unclean, your trade polluting, your very presence a blight on the community. So why on earth combine these two utterly reviled roles? Well, as we said, it was a grim kind of practicality. Both jobs dealt with the disposal of the unwanted and the unclean, unwanted criminals, unwanted animal remains. Both involved a whole lot of bloodshed, the handling of dead bodies, and a level of gore that would make most people faint. Both were absolutely essential to the functioning of medieval society, maintaining law and order, preventing the spread of animal diseases, providing those vital byproducts like tallow and glue. Yet both were deeply, deeply reviled by almost everyone. It was a cruel and incredibly awkward symmetry. The same person who, by order of the court, ended a human life in the morning, might then spend the afternoon collecting a dead horse from the roadside and rendering it down. What a life, huh? Your family, if you were brave or foolish enough to have one, shared your outcast status completely. Your children would be shunned at school, if they were even allowed to attend one, taunted in the streets. Marriage prospects for them? Severely limited. They'd often only be able to marry into other, similarly marginalized families. Perhaps the children of other executioners, or knackers from different towns, or maybe even the offspring of gong farmers or grave diggers. It was a lonely, insular, and often interbred existence. This inherited profession, born not of choice but of societal rejection and grim necessity, created this unique, isolated, and often misunderstood subculture within medieval society. Yet despite all this, there were some strange, small perks to being the executioner. You were often exempt from paying certain taxes and tolls, which was a nice little bonus. You might receive something called havage, which was the right to take a small portion of goods from market vendors for free, like a kind of tax you collected in kind. And of course, as we mentioned, you often got to keep the clothes and any meager personal possessions of your clients after their sentence had been carried out. Small comforts, perhaps, for a life lived perpetually in the darkest shadows, bearing the immense weight of society's ultimate sanctions and its most visceral disgust. You might also find yourself tasked with other odd and awkward jobs that nobody else wanted to touch, supervising brothels and gaming houses, and probably collecting a tax from them too, acting as a sort of informal pound keeper for stray animals, taxing lepers and prostitutes, more outcast groups, and even sometimes cleaning out the public latrines and cesspools if the town didn't have a dedicated gong farmer, or if his workload was too great. You were, in essence, the town's official go-to dealer in all things taboo, tainted, and terminally untidy. So, as the crowds finally disperse from the public square after a particularly grisly spectacle, or as the last animal carcass is rendered down into its useful components in your smoky, stinking yard, your long, hard day's work is done. You are society's necessary shadow, the cleaner of its most profound messes, both human and animal, the one who walks that terrifying razor's edge between law and utter revulsion. Rest now, if you can, for the medieval world, in all its brutality and pragmatism, always has more untidiness and more harsh judgments for you to attend to on the morrow. And the awkwardness of your existence, well, that's a heavy, blood-stained, and incredibly lonely cloak to bear through the long, dark night. All right, so we've faced some truly intense professions, haven't we? From the guy who literally dealt with everyone's crap, to the fella who got up close and personal with dead animals and dispatched criminals. Maybe you're thinking, okay, surely it can't get any more awkward or spiritually heavy than that. Oh, my sweet summer child. You underestimate the medieval world's capacity for truly unique and unsettling job descriptions. Tonight, we're tiptoeing into a realm that's less about physical grime and more about, well, the soul. And it's a lonely, lonely path. Congratulations. You are now a sin eater. This is a job. If you can even call it that. It's more like a really grim spiritual calling that lives in those shadowy, misty borderlands between ancient folklore, deep religious faith, and just plain human desperation. You won't find any fancy guilds for sin eaters, no official town charters proclaiming their importance. Nope, this is a folk custom, the kind of thing whispered about in hushed tones around the village fire, rarely written down in the big official history books, yet it's stuck around for ages in certain rural spots, especially in places like Wales and the English counties bordering it, like Shropshire and Herefordshire. Its roots, they probably stretch way, way back into the medieval period, maybe even further, even if the most detailed stories we have often come from a bit later, like the 17th and 19th centuries. It just goes to show how long these ancient anxieties about what happens after we die and what to do about a lifetime of regrets can hang around. So what, in the name of all that's holy, or unholy, depending on your point of view, does a sin eater actually do? Well, imagine this, a little cottage, shrouded in grief. Someone inside has died. Maybe it was sudden, a farming accident, a quick illness, a fall. And here's the kicker. They died without a priest being there to hear their final confession, without receiving the last rites of the church to cleanse their soul and prepare it for its big journey into the next world. Now, in an age of super strong religious belief, where the fate of your immortal soul was, like, the most important thing ever, this was a terrifying situation. The poor departed soul might be trapped, weighed down by all their unconfessed sins, unable to get into heaven, maybe stuck wandering as a restless ghost, or worse, facing a really, really long and unpleasant time in purgatory. The family? They're not just heartbroken by their loss, they're absolutely petrified about the spiritual danger their loved one is in. Total nightmare fuel for medieval folks. This is where you, the sin eater, get your very awkward call-up. You are, in essence, the spiritual scapegoat. You're the person who, through a very solemn, very strange, and deeply unsettling ritual, will literally take upon yourself all the sins of the person who just died. The idea is that by doing this, you free up their soul, make it lighter, so it can finally find peace and get to where it's supposed to be going. Sounds like a big responsibility, right? It is. How does word even get to you? There's no job board for Sin Eater Wanted. It's more like a hushed, desperate message, probably carried by a grieving family member under the cloak of twilight, or maybe even in the dead of night, to your lonely, isolated dwelling. Because here's the thing about being a Sin Eater. You do not live amongst the general population. Oh no. You are a total outcast, a figure of profound dread and often outright revulsion, even as your very specific services are being desperately sought. You might live in a tiny, dilapidated cottage way out on the edge of the moor, miles from the nearest village. Or perhaps you're just a constant wanderer, with no fixed home at all, just drifting from one solemn meal to the next. People see you as, well, unclean, tainted, maybe even in league with darker supernatural forces. Because who else, they'd whisper, would willingly take on the sins of others, effectively damning themselves over and over again? When you finally arrive at the house of mourning, stepping over the threshold into that heavy, sorrowful atmosphere, the air is thick not just with grief, but with a palpable, almost crackling tension. The family, even as they absolutely need you to perform this ritual for their loved one, will likely avoid your gaze. They might shrink away if you get too close. You are, to them, a necessary evil, a remedy that's almost as feared as the spiritual disease you're there to cure. Talk about an awkward welcome. The ritual itself, as recorded by folklorists and antiquarians like John Aubrey back in the 17th century, though it probably varied a bit by region and over time, had a consistent, solemn, and pretty chilling core. You are brought into the room, often the only room in a poor cottage, where the deceased lies, maybe laid out on their own bed, or perhaps already in a simple wooden coffin. Then, a piece of bread, sometimes just a plain crust, sometimes a specially baked small loaf, and a bowl of ale or beer are brought out. This food and drink would then be passed over the body of the deceased, sometimes back and forth a few times, or, even more directly, it might be laid right on the dead person's chest, or even near their mouth, for a short while. This symbolic act, this close contact, was believed to mystically draw out all the unconfessed sins, all the spiritual burdens and misdeeds of the departed soul, and transfer them into the bread and ale, like a spiritual sponge, soaking it all up. Now imagine yourself standing there, in that dim candlelit room. The family is watching you, their faces a mixture of grief, hope, and probably a fair bit of fear and disgust. The body of the deceased is right there, cold and still, and you, perhaps a figure described by John Aubrey in one famous account as a long, lean, ugly, lamentable rascal, ouch, Aubrey, harsh much, must now perform your sacred, yet deeply reviled duty. You take the bread, you take the ale, and you consume them. Every single bite, every single sip is not just about filling your probably often empty stomach. No, this is a profound spiritual transaction. With each mouthful, you are quite literally ingesting the spiritual burdens, the moral failings, the unconfessed and unabsolved transgressions of another human being. You are taking their potential damnation upon your own soul, so that they might find salvation. Heavy stuff, right? Sometimes, as you ate and drank, you'd be expected to recite specific words, a kind of incantation or prayer that sealed this terrible, solemn bargain. One version, recorded from Shropshire legend, goes something like this. I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man or woman. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul. Amen. I pawn my own soul. Just let those words sink in for a minute. You're basically saying, okay, God, all those bad things this person did, put them on my tab. I'll take the hit. The idea, as John Aubrey noted, was that this ritual would free the departed soul from walking after they were dead, basically stop them from becoming a restless, troublesome ghost. So this ritualistic consumption was the absolute heart of it, a very tangible, physical act designed to deal with the intangible, terrifying weight of sin, and to bring some measure of comfort and closure to the living, who desperately wanted to believe their loved one would find an easier passage into the afterlife. And for performing this incredibly heavy, soul-cleansing, for others anyway, service, your payment was usually pathetic. A real pittance, a few pennies, maybe a groat, which was a small silver coin worth about 4 pence. Or perhaps the food and drink itself, that sin-laden bread and ale, was considered a significant part of your fee. John Aubrey, in his account, mentions a payment of 6 pence for the service. This tiny amount of money really suggests that the role of senator was often taken up out of sheer, grinding poverty and absolute desperation. It was a last resort for people who had no other way to get even a meager meal or a few coins. Once the ritual was complete, once you'd swallowed that last crumb and drained that last drop, your presence was no longer welcome. In fact, it was often actively and sometimes violently repelled. Some accounts tell of the sin-eater being cursed at, shouted at, and even physically kicked, punched, or driven from the house with sticks or brooms by the very family who had just employed them. Why? Because now, in their eyes, you were utterly contaminated, carrying all those freshly ingested sins. They didn't want that spiritual yuckiness lingering in their home or, heaven forbid, somehow rubbing off on them. Any wooden bowl or platter that you, the sin-eater, had used for your solemn meal might be immediately chucked into the fire and burned, to destroy any lingering spiritual taint or connection to the sins you now carried. It was a swift, unceremonious, and incredibly awkward exit for someone who had just performed what was, to the grieving family, a vitally important spiritual service. Thanks for taking all our sins, now get out, you walking biohazard of bad karma. The life of a sin-eater was one of profound, almost unimaginable isolation. You were, as one rather vivid account from 1825 by Professor Evans of Carmarthen described it, abhorred by the superstitious villagers as a thing unclean. You would almost always live apart from the community, in some remote, tumble-down cottage on the desolate outskirts of the village, or as a constant wanderer, effectively cutting yourself off from all normal human social contact. People would actively avoid you as if you were a leper, or worse. It was considered a seriously bad omen to even accidentally look a sin-eater in the eye. Children would be warned away from you. You were often believed to be an associate of evil spirits and given to witchcraft, incantations, and unholy practices. After all, who else would willingly deal in such dark spiritual currency? The immense weight of all those consumed sins, it made you a figure of intense dread, a walking, talking, breathing repository of the entire community's collective transgressions. Yet, when death inevitably came knocking, and the paralyzing fear of an unabsolved soul loomed large, they still sought you out. This created such a strange, twisted paradox. You were reviled, feared, and utterly shunned in everyday life, yet you were deemed absolutely essential, if terrifyingly so, in the face of death. The community's fear of their loved one becoming a restless, unhappy ghost, or facing eternal punishment, would momentarily outweigh their fear and disgust of you, the sin-eater. But as soon as your grim task was done, you were thrust right back out into the shadows, your temporary, conditional acceptance instantly revoked. This constant cycle of desperate dependence, followed by immediate, harsh rejection, must have been a source of profound psychological torment and an incredibly awkward way to live. So who on earth actually became a sin-eater? As we've said, often it was the poorest of the poor, those long, lean, ugly, lamentable rascals, as John Aubrey so uncharitably described one. People driven to it by gnawing hunger and sheer desperation, they performed this soul-wrenching ritual for a pittance and a mouthful of food. Sometimes they were already wanderers, outsiders, or individuals perceived by the community as already existing on the very fringes of society, perhaps even thought to possess some unique, if deeply unsettling spiritual capacities that made them suitable for such a role. One fascinating 17th century account from a Reverend Edmund Prize in Wales mentions an old beggar named Cadi being summoned to eat the sins of a woman named Gwenllian Jones. Cadi was apparently deemed suitable precisely because of his vagrant outsider existence. After poor Cadi consumed the ritual meal, he was reportedly found the next morning babbling fearfully, which the villagers immediately took as a sure sign that his soul was now carrying the full weight of the dead woman's spiritual burden. Poor guy. However, just to make things even more interesting, The very last known sin-eater in Britain, a man named Richard Munslow, who died in Rattling Hope, Shropshire, way back in 1906, yes, 1906, was reportedly a respected and relatively well-off farmer. It's said that he took on the ancient role not out of poverty or desperation, but out of a genuine kindness to his community, and a desire to uphold this very old, fading tradition, especially for those who couldn't afford or access proper church burials. What an awkward and rather surprisingly noble deviation from the usual grim profile of the sin-eater. Officially, as you can probably guess, the church did not approve of sin-eating. Not one bit. The absolution of sins? That was their sacred territory, dispensed only through proper confession to a priest and the church's holy rites. So this whole practice of sin-eating was, technically, pretty illegal in some interpretations, or, at the very least, a deeply unorthodox folk ritual that bordered on heresy. Employing a sin-eater could potentially brand a family as being a bit dodgy in their beliefs, a bit too close to old superstitions. And yet, it persisted for centuries, especially in those remote, isolated rural areas where the old ways died hard and priests might be few and far between. Some local vicars reportedly just turned a blind eye to the custom, perhaps understanding, on a human level, the deep-seated psychological comfort it brought to their grieving, fearful parishioners, who were terrified for the souls of loved ones who had died without the chance for last rites. It was a kind of awkward, unacknowledged compromise between official religious doctrine and the persistent, powerful pull of ancient folk belief. A way for small communities to try and manage their spiritual anxieties in a way that resonated with their local traditions, even if it wasn't strictly by the book. So, the strange, solemn ritual is finally done. The sins are ingested. The deceased is, hopefully, on their way to a more peaceful afterlife, their soul lightened by your sacrifice. And you, dear sin-eater, you are left with the crushing spiritual weight, the profound social isolation, and the cold, stale crumbs of a very somber meal. As you walk away from that house of mourning, perhaps with a few miserable coins clutched tightly in your pocket, and a belly full of bread, ale, and the collective transgressions of another now departed human life, you are a truly unique, a truly lonely, and a truly deeply awkward figure in the historical landscape. Sleep now, if your conscience, now heavy with the sins of many, and your stomach, digesting that solemn, spiritually charged fare, will possibly allow. For the burden you choose, or are forced, to carry, well, it's unlike any other, and the path you walk is one that very, very few would ever dare to tread. The endless turn. Life as a human rotisserie. Ah, the magnificent medieval feast. Just close your eyes for a second and try to picture it. We're talking visions of whole roasted boars, their skin crackling and glistening with rendered fat, plump, juicy chickens and ducks turning a perfect golden brown, maybe even a majestic swan, if it's a super fancy royal banquet. And then there are those great hefty haunches of venison or mutton, slowly, hypnotically rotating over a massive, roaring, crackling fire. The air in the great hall, and especially in the kitchens, would be absolutely thick with the rich, savory aroma of cooking meat, the fragrant scent of herbs stuffed into cavities or rubbed onto skins, and the unmistakable, comforting smell of wood smoke. Sounds amazing, right? Makes your mouth water just thinking about it. But hold on a minute. Who or what was actually doing all that turning? That constant, crucial, and incredibly precise rotation that ensured the magnificent joint of meat cooked evenly all the way through, rather than ending up a charred and edible cinder on one side and disappointingly raw and bloody on the other. Before clever clockwork roasting mechanisms, known as roasting jacks, became more common in later centuries, and even then, they were expensive and mostly found in very wealthy households. Or, even more ingeniously, and perhaps a bit cruelly, before specially bred dogs were put into little treadmill-like wheels to power the spit, that vital, relentless task fell to a human. And often, that human was a small, young boy, the absolute lowest of the low in the bustling, hierarchical, and often brutally hot kitchen pecking order. So tonight, dear listener, you are that unfortunate, unsung hero of the hearth, the spit boy. Sometimes, You might also be called a turn broach, broach being another word for spit, or simply a scullion if turning the spit was just one of your many menial, back-breaking kitchen duties. Get ready, because you are in for a long, incredibly hot, mind-numbingly tedious, and profoundly awkward shift, right there in the fiery, smoky heart of the medieval kitchen. The medieval kitchen, especially in a grand castle, a wealthy manor house, or a bustling monastery, was a place of intense, almost overwhelming controlled chaos. It was constantly bustling with activity, incredibly noisy, and unbelievably, suffocatingly hot. Imagine huge open hearths, sometimes more than one in a very large kitchen, blazing away with roaring log fires. Smoke, despite rudimentary chimneys or simple smoke holes in the roof, often filled the vast, stone-vaulted room, stinging your eyes, making you cough constantly, and coating every surface, including you, with a fine, greasy layer of soot. Cooks, their faces red and glistening with sweat, perpetually stressed and short-tempered, would be shouting orders and instructions, their voices barely audible above the constant clang and clatter of heavy iron pots and copper pans, the rhythmic chop-chop-chop of cleavers and knives on massive wooden butcher's blocks, and the general din of a busy food production line. And you were stationed right in the very thick of it, in what was undoubtedly the hottest, smokiest, most uncomfortable, and least desirable spot in the entire kitchen. Your little corner was probably also the greasiest, with years of accumulated fat splatters coating the nearby walls and floor, making footing treacherous. Your designated domain, a small patch of stone floor, often perilously close to the roaring, spitting flames of the open fire, where the massive iron spit, heavily laden with a huge joint of meat, or perhaps several skewered chickens, ducks, or game birds, was laboriously mounted on sturdy iron supports. Sometimes, if you were particularly lucky, or if the head cook was in an unusually benevolent mood, which was rare, let's be honest, you might be allowed to sit or crouch behind a makeshift screen. Perhaps a rough wooden board propped up, or even a bale of damp hay or a wet sackcloth hung up, offering a token, and probably largely ineffective, shield from the most intense, searing, skin-blistering heat radiating from the fire. But mostly, you just slowly cooked right alongside the joint you were turning, absorbing the same relentless, oppressive warmth, hour after agonizing hour. Your clothes, likely a single rough tunic, would be perpetually damp with sweat and stained with grease and soot. The sensory details of your sweltering little station would be completely overwhelming. The heat, it was a constant physical assault, searing your face until it felt permanently flushed and tight, making your rough spun, probably already threadbare, clothes stick uncomfortably to your skin with sweat. Your lips would be perpetually cracked from the dry heat, your throat raw and scratchy from the smoky air. The smell of the roasting meat, so rich, savory, and delicious, would be a constant, cruel tease, a tantalizing reminder of the magnificent feast you were helping to prepare, but would likely only get to taste in the form of a few leftover, gnawed-on scraps or a hurriedly snatched greasy bone, if you were incredibly lucky and the cook wasn't looking. But that wonderful aroma of cooking meat would be inextricably mixed with the sharp, acrid bite of wood smoke that stung your eyes until they were red and watering, made you cough until your small chest ached, and filled your young, developing lungs day in and day out with soot and grime. Then there was the constant, unnerving sizzle and angry spit of hot fat, dripping from the turning meat into the flames below, sending up little puffs of greasy smoke, and the occasional, startlingly hot, angry spark that might land on your bare arms, legs, or face. You had to be constantly alert, flinching away from these fiery missiles. The floor around your station would be slick with grease, adding another layer of discomfort and potential hazard. Your job, while sounding deceptively simple in its description, turn the spit, was brutally demanding, both physically and mentally, in its execution. Slowly, constantly, evenly, without stopping, for hours, and hours, and hours on end. The weight of a large spit, laden with a whole pig or several birds, could be considerable, and maintaining a steady, even rotation required surprising strength and unwavering concentration from a small child. If you stopped for even a moment to rest your aching arms, or if you turn the spit too slowly, or too quickly, or unevenly, the magnificent, expensive roast would inevitably burn to a blackened, inedible cinder on one side, while remaining unappetizingly raw and bloody on the other. And the cook, oh, the head cook, a figure of immense, unquestioned authority and often terrifying temper in the kitchen hierarchy, would not be pleased, not one bit. His wrath, it was often said, could be as fiery and unpredictable as the hearth itself, and a ruined roast could easily earn you a painful clout around the ear, with a heavy wooden spoon, a kick to the shins, a barrage of inventive and colorful curses that would make a sailor blush, or even instant dismissal from your already miserable job. For a poor boy, perhaps an orphan, or from a destitute family, with no other skills or connections, dismissal could be a virtual death sentence, meaning starvation or a life of begging on the streets. The fear was a constant motivator. Your working day often started in the absolute dead of night, perhaps as early as 3 or 4 a.m., especially if a particularly grand feast or banquet was planned for that day, requiring multiple courses and many, many hours of roasting for different meats. You'd be up before anyone else, perhaps helping to stoke the fires, feeling the chill of the pre-dawn kitchen slowly give way to the oppressive heat. And the turning, it just went on and on and on, seemingly forever. The sheer, crushing monotony of the task must have been staggering, almost unbearable for a young, active mind. Round and round, the heavy iron spit turning slowly in your tired, aching, blistered hands. Your eyes, stinging from the smoke, would be fixed, almost hypnotized, on the slowly browning, crisping meat, the mesmerizing but dangerously hot dance of the flames in the hearth. You try to find ways to pass the endless hours, maybe humming little tunes to yourself under your breath, counting the drips of fat, or letting your mind wander to imaginary adventures far away from the suffocating kitchen. But you couldn't let your attention stray for too long, and forget about taking breaks. No popping out for a quick breath of relatively fresh air. No stretching your cramped legs, unless the cook specifically allowed it, which was rare. And absolutely, positively, no toilet breaks were permitted, especially if the roast was at a critical stage of cooking. As one rather grimly pragmatic historical source notes, regarding the duties of a spit boy, we don't want that meat burning, do we? The implication was brutally clear. Your basic bodily needs, your comfort, your very childhood, were entirely secondary to the perfect, uninterrupted roasting of the master's dinner. This brutal combination of intense physical discomfort, the searing heat, the choking smoke, the awkward, cramped posture of sitting or crouching on a small stool, or even directly on the greasy stone floor by the fire for hours, and the soul-destroying, mind-numbing monotony of the repetitive task made this job uniquely grueling and utterly miserable. It was especially awful considering it was likely performed for very little actual pay, perhaps just a few scraps of leftover food at the end of a long day, and absolutely no recognition or thanks. It was a task of pure, unadulterated endurance, not skill or artistry, and certainly not a job for a child. As a spit boy, or a lowly scullion assigned this unenviable duty, you were at the very, very bottom of the complex and rigidly enforced kitchen hierarchy. You were the kitchen ghost, the smallest cog. You'd be taking orders and probably a fair bit of verbal and sometimes physical abuse from absolutely everyone. The tyrannical head cook, often a large, intimidating figure, ruled the kitchen with an iron fist, and sometimes an iron ladle. The stressed-out undercooks, themselves under immense pressure, would pass that pressure down to you. The pantler, in charge of the bread and pantry, might snap at you. The butler, overseeing the wine and ale cellars, would ignore you. Probably even the scullery maids, who spent their days up to their elbows in greasy, cold water washing mountains of pots and pans, ranked above you and wouldn't hesitate to tell you so. Imagine being constantly shouted at, berated by a red-faced, sweating, perpetually angry cook for letting the roast get just a tiny bit too crispy on one edge, a mistake easily made when you're half-blinded by smoke and fighting off sleep. All while you're sweating buckets yourself, your eyes are watering uncontrollably, your throat is raw from coughing, and your small hands are covered in painful, raw, and often weeping blisters from gripping the rough wooden or iron spit handle for countless agonizing hours. It was a thankless, miserable, and incredibly awkward existence, especially for a child who should have been playing or learning, not toiling in such conditions. The hazards of the hearth were numerous, constant, and often severe. The most obvious and ever-present danger was, of course, the open fire itself. Leaping, unpredictable sparks could easily ignite your ragged tunic or singe your hair. Spitting molten hot fat from the roasting meat could cause nasty, painful burns if it landed on your exposed skin, and you were probably wearing very little to begin with, given the heat. The intense, radiating, suffocating heat itself was a major hazard. Burns, ranging from minor, stinging singes to more serious, debilitating injuries that could easily become infected in the generally unhygienic conditions of a medieval kitchen, were an accepted and unfortunately common part of the job. Heat exhaustion, or even potentially fatal heat stroke, in the smoky, poorly ventilated, and oven-like conditions of the kitchen was a very real and constant possibility, especially during long, hot summer days when the fires still had to be kept roaring for hours to feed the household. You might feel dizzy, nauseous, your head pounding, but stopping wasn't an option. The sheer, mind-numbing boredom, hour after endless hour of the exact same repetitive turning motion, could also easily lead to dangerous lapses in concentration. A moment's distraction, a brief nod of overwhelming sleepiness, and how incredibly easy it would be to doze off, despite the heat, from sheer bone-deep exhaustion and the hypnotic monotony of the task, and the crucial rhythm of the turning spit would be broken. The precious, expensive roast could be ruined in minutes, leading instantly to a furious, terrifying tongue-lashing from the cook, or worse, a swift, painful clout around the ear, with a heavy wooden spoon, a sharp kick to the shins, or even instant dismissal from your job if the damage to the master's dinner was deemed too severe. And the physical strain? It was constant and cumulative. Sitting or crouching in one awkward, uncomfortable position on a hard floor or a tiny stool for so many hours, day after day, performing that same repetitive turning motion with a heavy, often unbalanced iron spit, it would inevitably take a terrible toll on young, still-growing bodies. Aching backs that never seemed to stop hurting, sore, stiff shoulders and arms that burned with every rotation, and painfully raw, blistered hands that never got a chance to heal properly were the daily, unwelcome companions of every medieval spit boy. You'd probably fall into your straw bed at night too exhausted to even eat the meager scraps you were given, only to be roused again before dawn to start the whole fiery torment anew. Eventually, sometime around the 16th century, someone, somewhere, had a rather bright, if slightly unsettling from an animal welfare perspective, idea. Why use a tired, distractible, easily bored, and probably constantly, and justifiably, complaining human boy when you could, perhaps, use a dog? And thus the remarkable and rather pitiable turnspit dog was specifically bred and developed for this very purpose. These were often peculiar-looking, sturdy canines, frequently described in contemporary accounts as being long-bodied with short, sometimes crooked or bowed legs, a bit like a corgi or a dachshund in build, but specifically bred for stamina and a willingness to run for hours. These dogs were placed inside a large, circular wooden wheel, very much like a giant hamster wheel, which was usually mounted high on the kitchen wall, often near the chimney to take advantage of the rising heat for ventilation, though it probably just made it hotter for the dog. This wheel was then cleverly connected by a system of chains, ropes, and pulleys to the roasting spit. As the dog diligently ran and ran and ran inside its wheel, the wheel turned, and, hey presto, the spit revolved, roasting the meat to, hopefully, even perfection. This gradual transition from human boy power to canine power for turning the spit, which became more common from the 16th century onwards, though spit boys were still used in many places for a long time after, marks an early, if somewhat grim and ethically questionable form of automation in the kitchen. It was driven primarily, one suspects, by the sheer, unadulterated unpleasantness and mind-numbing drudgery of the job, and perhaps by the fact that dogs complained less than small boys, or at least their complaints were easier to ignore. One can only imagine the profound relief a young spit boy might have felt at being finally freed from his daily fiery torment. Or perhaps, alongside that relief, there was a small, awkward twinge of jealousy, or even indignation, as a small, panting dog literally took over his sweltering, miserable post. Though, it must be said, the dog's lot was often no better, and sometimes even demonstrably worse. These dedicated turnspit dogs, sadly, were often treated as mere, quote, kitchen utensils, or pieces of biological machinery, rather than as living, feeling creatures. They were sometimes cruelly urged on by having a hot coal thrown into their wheel to make them run faster if they slacked off, or they might be kept trapped and running in the wheel for many exhausting hours in the intense heat and choking smoke of the kitchen, often with little water or rest. It was an awkward and often deeply cruel solution to an undeniably awkward and unpleasant job, essentially shifting the burden of suffering from one vulnerable young being to another, equally vulnerable animal one. This practice really reflects the highly utilitarian and often unsentimental view of animals that was common in the period, where their welfare was almost always secondary to their perceived function and usefulness to humans. Some households even kept 2 turnspit dogs, working them in shifts, which is thought to be one possible origin of the phrase, "every dog has his day." On their day off, these hard-working canines might even be taken to church, not for any spiritual enlightenment, of course, but because their warm bodies made excellent, if slightly dog-scented, foot warmers for the human congregants during long, cold services. So as your incredibly long, hot, and tedious shift finally ends, or perhaps as you watch, with a complicated mixture of relief and perhaps a touch of pity, a small, sturdy, panting dog take your former place in that relentlessly turning wheel, you can at long last step away from the inferno of the hearth. Your rough homespun clothes are completely soaked through with sweat, clinging uncomfortably to your skin. Your face is grimy with layers of soot and grease, and the once tantalizing smell of roast meat, which might have made your empty stomach rumble with desperate hunger at the start of the day, now just serves as a cloying, unwelcome reminder of your endless, thankless toil, a scent that will stubbornly linger with you in your hair and on your clothes for many hours to come, no matter how hard you try to scrub it away. But the magnificent feast will be served. The Lord and his noble guests will dine in splendor, laughing and joking, remarking perhaps on the succulence and perfect, even cooking of the roast, and most likely without a single thought or even a moment's fleeting awareness of the hot, tedious, exhausting, and incredibly awkward work that went into its meticulous preparation by a small, forgotten, and utterly insignificant boy. Sleep now, little spit-turner. If the persistent aches in your young back and the stinging soreness in your smoke-filled eyes will let you, and try to dream of cool, clear breezes, of splashing joyfully in a cold, refreshing stream, and of a job, any job at all, that is far, far away from the suffocating heat, the choking smoke, and the endless, hypnotic, soul-destroying turning of the medieval kitchen fire. You've certainly earned your rest and a few pleasant dreams, if nothing else. His Majesty's most intimate attendant, the power behind the privy. Okay, so we've been through some pretty rough and tumble jobs, right? From the depths of the town's underbelly to the fiery pits of the kitchen. But now, let's polish our boots, metaphorically speaking, of course, and step into the surprisingly intimate and unexpectedly powerful world of the royal court. Tonight, dear listener, we're not just talking about any old job. We're talking about a position so close to the monarch, it's almost too close for comfort. Congratulations. You are, or at least you aspire to be, the groom of the king's close stool. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, and so much more. Now, before your nose wrinkles too much, let's break down that rather grand, if slightly alarming, title. Groom. That's an attendant, someone who takes care of something, or someone important. King. Well, that part's pretty straightforward. We're talking top of the royal food chain here. And close stool, that, my friend, is the fancy, medieval, and Tudor-era term for a portable toilet. A commode. A chamber pot, but make it royal. Think of it as a throne of a very, very different and significantly more private kind, and your job, in its most fundamental, original, and undeniably awkward sense, is to attend to the king, yes, the actual king of England, or whichever noble you served before climbing the royal ladder, in his most private, most vulnerable, most fundamentally human moments. Yep, you are essentially in charge of royal emissions management. What a gig. This role, especially in its earlier medieval forms before it got all fancy and powerful, might have been less formally titled. Perhaps it just fell under the general duties of a trusted chamber attendant, a valet of the privy chamber, or a yeoman of the chamber. The core function, however, was always there, assisting the lord or king with his daily ablutions and, well, his necessaries. And this wasn't just about handing over the medieval equivalent of toilet paper, which, for a king, would likely be fine linen cloths, not the scratchy moss or hay that less fortunate folks might use. No, this was about managing the entire, delicate process with utmost discretion and efficiency. Imagine the closed stool itself. This wasn't some crude wooden bucket tucked away in a dark corner not for a monarch. Oh no. It would be a substantial piece of furniture, often elaborately carved from fine wood, perhaps padded with velvet or silk for royal comfort, with a hinged lid to keep things contained. Beneath the comfortable seat, there'd be a removable pewter or ceramic pot, sometimes with a handle, designed to catch the royal deposits. This whole contraption might be housed in a small, private chamber or closet, often called the privy chamber, hence the term, sometimes with fragrant herbs like lavender or rosemary strewn about, or pomanders filled with spices hung nearby, in a valiant, if often futile, attempt to combat the inevitable and often potent odors. Your first and most basic duty as groom of the stool was the meticulous care and maintenance of this incredibly important piece of royal apparatus. You ensured it was always spotlessly clean, or as clean as such a thing could be, that the pot was emptied regularly and discreetly. Not by you, thankfully, if you were high-ranking enough. That rather less glamorous task would fall to a lower-status servant, perhaps even our old friend the gong farmer if the palace had an external contract. And that fresh water, fine linen towels, and a ewer, a type underscore of pitcher, were always at hand for the king's post-business ablutions. You were the curator of the king's comfort station. The act of attendance itself was one of supreme, almost unnerving intimacy. When the king felt the call of nature, and kings, despite their divine right, were just as human as the rest of us in that regard, you, the groom of the stool, would be summoned. You would escort His Majesty to the privy chamber, assist him with disrobing if necessary, and medieval royal attire, with its layers of velvet, fur, and complex fastenings, could be incredibly cumbersome and difficult to manage alone. And then, well, then you'd be there, present, in that small, confined space, with the most powerful man in the kingdom, as he did his business. Perhaps you'd discreetly avert your gaze, maintaining a respectful silence. Perhaps, if the king was in a talkative mood, you'd engage in quiet, hushed conversation, discussing matters of state or personal concerns. Or, perhaps you'd simply stand ready, a silent, attentive sentinel. The precise level of direct physical assistance required is a subject of some historical debate, and probably varied over time and with individual monarchs. Did the groom of the stool actually wipe the royal posterior? Some historical sources, like the 15th century Book of Nurture, give rather explicit instructions for a chamberlain to ensure there was blanket, cotton, or linen to wipe the nether end, and to wait ready and prompt, with basin and ewer, implying a very hands-on role. Others suggest that by the Tudor period, the groom's role was more supervisory, providing the necessary tools and ensuring the king's comfort and dignity, rather than performing the most personal cleansing himself. Either way, you were privy, pun absolutely intended, and you can bet they made that joke back then too, to sights, sounds, and smells that no one else in the kingdom, not even the queen, the royal children, or the king's most powerful ministers, would regularly experience. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover the potential for uncomfortable moments. But here's where it gets really interesting. One of your most crucial, and perhaps most delicate and stomach-churning responsibilities was the careful monitoring of the king's health through his output. In an era when medical diagnosis was often a rather hit-or-miss affair, relying heavily on observation and ancient theories rather than scientific testing, the king's stools were seen as a vital indicator of his overall well-being. You, as the groom of the stool, would be expected to discreetly observe the color, the consistency, the frequency, and even, yes, the smell of the royal emissions. You might then be required to report your detailed findings to the royal physician, who would use this intimate information to diagnose potential ailments, assess the king's humors, and prescribe treatments, perhaps a change in diet, some herbal remedies, or, inevitably, a good old-fashioned bloodletting. Your Majesty's stool physician was a rather alarming shade of green this morning, with a consistency not unlike lumpy porridge, and a bouquet that spoke of perhaps too much spiced wine and roasted swan last eve. You were, in essence, a highly specialized medical scout, operating on the very front lines of royal digestive health. This was no small or trivial matter. The health of the monarch was, quite literally, the health and stability of the entire kingdom. A sick or incapacitated king could mean political instability, succession crises, opportunistic rebellions, and widespread chaos. So your observations, however unpleasant they might have been to gather, were of genuine political and national importance. You also had a unique and unparalleled insight into the king's diet, his daily habits, his moods, and his general physical condition. You knew what he ate, when he ate it, and how it affected him. This kind of intimate knowledge, in the highly charged and often secretive atmosphere of the royal court, could be incredibly invaluable. Now, while the early medieval origins of this rather unique role might have been more purely functional and perhaps less prestigious, by the Tudor period in England, particularly under powerful and often larger-than-life monarchs like Henry VIII, the position of groom of the stool had transformed almost unbelievably into one of the most coveted, influential, and surprisingly powerful positions at court. Why this dramatic upgrade from glorified toilet attendant to major political player? It all came down to one simple, yet overwhelmingly significant factor: that unparalleled, unfiltered, intimate access to the king. The groom of the stool was with the king when he was at his most unguarded, his most relaxed, hopefully, his most human. Away from the pomp and ceremony of public court life, away from the prying eyes and straining ears of ambitious nobles, scheming ministers, and foreign ambassadors, the king, in the privacy of his privy chamber, might speak his mind freely. He might share his deepest worries, his most secret plans, his true opinions on people and policies. You weren't just the keeper of the king's commode anymore. You rapidly became the keeper of his most closely guarded confidences. You were, quite literally, in the room where it happened, even if it was sometimes just nature taking its course. This extraordinary proximity inevitably bred trust, and often genuine friendship. The groom of the stool frequently became a de facto personal secretary, a trusted confidant, a sounding board, and sometimes the king's closest and most loyal friend. He controlled who got to see the king in these private, informal moments. He might read to the king from important documents or entertaining books, handle his most private and sensitive correspondence, and even manage the privy purse, the king's personal household finances and discretionary spending money. This financial responsibility alone gave him enormous influence and patronage. Courtiers seeking favor, petitioners with urgent requests, ambassadors trying to push a particular agenda, they might all try to curry favor with or go through the groom of the stool to get their message to the king. He was the ultimate gatekeeper to the king's private world, and therefore a very significant, if unofficial, player in the complex and often treacherous political landscape of the royal court. Men of high birth, often the sons of prominent noblemen or influential gentry, actively vied for this seemingly bizarre position. It came with a handsome salary, luxurious lodgings within the palace, often a suite of rooms conveniently located very near the king's own private apartments, the king's old clothes, which, for a fashion-conscious and extravagant monarch like Henry VIII, were incredibly valuable, made from the finest silks, velvets, and furs, and immense, if subtle, status. Figures like Sir Henry Norris and Sir Anthony Denny, who both served as grooms of the stool to Henry VIII, were men of immense power and considerable wealth, deeply involved in the political and religious upheavals of their turbulent times. It's a truly mind-boggling paradox. A job whose core, fundamental function was, to put it as politely as possible, dealing with royal excrement, became a golden ticket to the highest echelons of power, influence, and social standing. The historian David Starkey has argued quite persuasively that the role was seen as incredibly honorable precisely because it involved such intimate, personal, and often solitary service to the sacred person of the king. The monarch's body, after all, was considered divinely appointed, and to attend to its most basic needs was a mark of supreme trust and favor. But even with all the power, prestige, and perks that later accrued to the role, the fundamental, inescapable awkwardness of that core duty never entirely vanished. Imagine trying to discuss grave matters of state or offer solemn, considered advice on foreign policy, while the king is, well, otherwise engaged on his close stool. Imagine the sheer, unwavering effort required to maintain an air of dignified composure, of respectful attentiveness, in such uniquely challenging circumstances. The level of discretion required was absolutely immense. One ill-timed remark, one flicker of disgust or amusement at an inopportune moment, one breach of confidence could spell absolute disaster for your career, and, in the volatile Tudor court, quite possibly for your head as well. You would need to be a master of tact and diplomacy, a keen observer of human nature, especially royal nature with all its whims and caprices, and possess a stomach that was, if not actually made of iron, then at least exceptionally well-disciplined and uncomplaining. You'd also need to be physically robust, able to assist the king if he was unwell or unsteady, and always, always present, always ready, at any hour of the day or night. The king's bodily functions, after all, waited for no man, not even his most trusted groom. The specific title, Groom of the Stool, was largely an English phenomenon, particularly prominent from the Tudor era until it was formally abolished in the early 20th century, in 1901, by King Edward VII, though its functions and the intimacy of the role had changed considerably by then, becoming more of an honorific title. However, the underlying concept of trusted attendants responsible for the monarch's most private and personal needs existed in many royal courts across Europe, in many different forms, and under various titles. The 15th century English text, the Book of Nurture, for example, gives detailed instructions for a chamberlain on how to properly prepare the privy for his lord, ensuring its cleanliness, providing the necessary cloths, basin, and ewer. A clear indication of this kind of intimate personal service in the late medieval period, even before the role reached its absolute zenith of power and influence under the Tudors. So the Groom of the Stool, a truly unique, often misunderstood, and undeniably awkward medieval and early modern profession. It began with the most basic, most humbling of human needs, and through the strange alchemy of royal favor and unparalleled proximity, it evolved into a position of extraordinary influence and considerable power. It's a potent reminder that power can often be found in the most unexpected and unglamorous of places, and that even within the gilded, perfumed halls of royalty, the mundane, the awkward, and the utterly inescapably human are never very far away. You were the king's closest secret keeper, his bathroom buddy, his personal health consultant, his emissions expert, a high-born nobleman effectively in charge of the royal chamber pot. And in the intricate, often bizarre, and always fascinating dance of medieval courtly life, that, my friend, made you a very, very important person indeed, as long as you didn't wrinkle your nose at the wrong moment, or betray the confidences whispered in the most private of chambers. Rest well, noble groom. Your service, however strange, was undeniably significant. Squeaks in the shadows, the rat-catcher's perilous prowl, medieval towns and cities bustling with life, commerce, and community, but also teeming with other, less welcome residents. Rats. Everywhere. These weren't the cute domesticated rodents some keep as pets today. These were often black rats, ratus, agile climbers and prolific breeders, carriers of fleas, and therefore carriers of disease. Most notoriously, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which devastated populations. Beyond disease, they gnawed through precious food supplies, stored in granaries and homes, nested in thatched roofs and straw bedding, contaminated water sources, and generally made life itchy, unsanitary, and precarious. Someone had to fight this furry, fast-breeding menace, and that someone, a brave, or perhaps just desperate soul, was the rat catcher. Tonight, that's you. Your job was to catch and dispose of rats and other troublesome vermin. You'd patrol the filthy, narrow streets, the dark, refuse-strewn alleyways, the overflowing markets, and the cramped, dirty homes of rich and poor alike, wherever the telltale signs of infestation appeared. Imagine your working environment. Medieval streets were often unpaved, slick with mud and animal droppings, and frequently used as informal dumping grounds for household waste. The stench of refuse, decaying organic matter, and the musky, unsettling smell of dense rat infestations would have been your constant companion. The sounds of your trade were the rustling in the walls, the frantic squeaking from beneath the floorboards, the sudden scurry of tiny feet in the shadows, a symphony of scurrying that meant business was good, if unpleasant. Your tools of the trade were often crude, especially in the earlier medieval period, though they became more sophisticated over time. Rudimentary traps, perhaps a simple weighted plank and stick, or later, small spring-loaded traps were your first line of defense. However, rats are notoriously cunning, and these traps weren't always effective against a wary rodent. Poisons were sometimes used, though with great caution. Early pesticides might have included sulfur-based compounds or mixtures involving potent herbs. Later periods saw the use of more dangerous substances like arsenic, but these came with significant risks, not just to the rats, but to humans, pets, and livestock, if not handled with extreme care and knowledge. Using poison in enclosed spaces like homes or granaries was particularly problematic, as poisoned rats often crawled into inaccessible places like wall cavities or under floorboards to die, leading to new and even more revolting odors as they decomposed. Often your best allies in this relentless war were four-legged. Cats, of course, were natural ratters, and many households kept them for this very purpose, a tradition dating back to ancient Egypt. Terrier dogs, small, tenacious, and bred for their hunting prowess, were invaluable companions, able to pursue rats into tight spaces and dispatch them quickly. And then there were ferrets. Oh, the brave, slinky ferret. These agile mustelids were sent into rat burrows and warrens to flush out the occupants. You and your terrier would wait, with bated breath, at the escape holes for the furry explosion of fleeing rats. Managing these animal assistants was an art in itself, and an awkward one at that. Ferrets needed to be kept hungry enough to hunt with vigor, but not so starved that they'd gorge themselves on rat carcasses underground and get trapped, or even suffocate in a blocked tunnel. You'd have to listen intently for changes in the sounds of activity beneath the surface, ready to dig out your valuable ferret if it got into trouble. And your dogs needed careful training not to harm the ferrets, which were often more valuable than the rats themselves. This variety of methods, from simple traps to complex interspecies teamwork, demonstrates both the ingenuity and the sheer desperation involved in medieval pest control. Some particularly bold or perhaps reckless rat catchers, like the famed Jack Black, who served as Queen Victoria's rat catcher in the 19th century, though his era is later than medieval, his methods likely had older roots, would even attempt to catch rats with their bare hands. They might rub oils of aniseed and thyme on their hands and clothing, believing these scents attracted rats. This was, predictably, a recipe for many, many painful bites. In some regions, like France, rat catchers were a common sight, walking the city streets, perhaps with cats in cages, and often carrying a stick or pole from which a few dead rats were gruesomely suspended. A rather grim form of advertising their services, all the while yelling a cry like, "Morto rats! Death to the rats!" The dangers of your profession were manifold. Rats bite hard, and their teeth, constantly gnawing on filth, aren't exactly hygienic. The risk of nasty infections, fevers, or even rabies from a rat bite was a constant occupational hazard. Jack Black, the Victorian rat catcher, bore the scars of his profession all over his body, and nearly died 3 times from infected bites. More terrifying was the ever-present threat of disease. You were constantly wading through filth, handling potentially plague-ridden rats and their fleas. You were, in essence, on the front line of society's battle against epidemic disease, often succumbing to the very sicknesses you were trying to prevent. Working in dark, cramped, unsanitary spaces like sewers, damp cellars, and overflowing garbage heaps was part and parcel of the job. It was a dirty, dangerous, and deeply unpleasant existence. What of your social standing? It was a curious mix. Because of the clear and present dangers that rats posed, spreading the plague, destroying vital food supplies, the rat catcher was, in terms of function, a well-respected and very important position in society. Your work was undeniably crucial for public health and the preservation of resources. However, the grim nature of the work, the constant association with filth, vermin, and death, often meant that rat catchers operated on the fringes of society. They might be viewed with a mixture of necessity and disdain, a sort of grudging respect mixed with revulsion. Their distinctive attire, sometimes described in later periods as including top hats adorned with rat tails and bags filled with their quarry, would have marked them out, setting them apart from other tradesfolk. And then there's the most famous rat catcher in all of folklore, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The legend, dating back to a supposed event in 1284 in the German town of Hamelin, tells of a mysterious, brightly dressed stranger who offered to rid the rat-infested town of its plague of rodents for a fee. He did so by playing a magical pipe, luring all the rats into the river Weser, where they drowned. But when the ungrateful townsfolk refused to pay him the promised sum, the piper, in a chilling act of revenge, used his pipe again. This time, it wasn't rats that followed his enchanting tune, but the children of Hamelin, who disappeared with him into a mountain, never to be seen again. This powerful and enduring legend hints at the strange and ambivalent societal view of those who dealt with the unseen, verminous world. Rat catchers possessed an almost magical ability to solve a critical problem, a skill that was highly valued. Yet, they were also figures who, if crossed or disrespected, could be perceived as dangerous or untrustworthy, wielding a power that was not entirely understood or controlled by the community. The Pied Piper story encapsulates this awkward tension perfectly. Some rat catchers even augmented their income by selling live rats for the gruesome sport of rat baiting, where dogs were set upon caged rats for public entertainment and wagering, a practice more common in later centuries but perhaps with earlier roots. This again highlights the rat catchers' somewhat morally ambiguous position, profiting from the very creatures they were hired to eliminate. So, as the day or night ends, and you've made your rounds, perhaps with a slightly lighter rat population in one quarter of the town and a heavier bag on your shoulder, you can retire to your humble dwelling, likely on the edge of that same town. You are a guardian against the gnawing darkness, a warrior in an endless, squeaking battle. Rest now, rat catcher, for the rats never truly sleep, and their hunger, like yours, is eternal. The shadows will always need your awkward and essential attention. And so, our journey through the murky, smelly, and often perilous alleyways of medieval employment comes to a close. We've walked in the urine-soaked boots of the fuller, descended into the fragrant depths with the gong farmer, offered our own legs as a feast for the leech collector, wielded both razor and saw with the barber surgeon, faced societal scorn with the executioner and the sin-eater, endured the fiery monotony of the spit-boy, attended the most private royal moments with the groom of the stool, and battled the relentless tide of vermin with the rat-catcher. What a cast of characters! What a collection of careers! These weren't jobs for the faint of heart or the weak of stomach. They were often born of harsh necessity, in a world where survival itself was a daily challenge. The awkwardness we've explored tonight came in so many forms. The physical disgust of wading through waste or handling diseased bodies, the social stigma that clung to those who performed unclean but vital tasks, the constant dance with danger, be it from toxic fumes, infected wounds, or the sharp end of a rat's tooth. Yet through it all, these individuals persevered. They found ways to cope, to endure, to make a living in a world that often offered few comfortable choices. The gong farmer's good pay was a strange compensation for his nightly ordeal. The fuller's stinky stomping produced the very fabric of society. The leech collector, despite the risks, provided a much sought-after medical commodity. The barber surgeon, for all the terror of his tools, was often the only hope for the injured or afflicted. The executioner, shunned and feared, paradoxically sometimes served as a healer. The sin-eater, a lonely scapegoat, offered a desperate kind of solace to the grieving. The spitboy's endless turning fed the great halls. The groom of the stool's intimate service became a pathway to incredible power, and the rat-catcher stood as a vital, if grimy, guardian of public health. Their lives remind us that history isn't just about kings and queens, battles and castles. It's also about the everyday struggles, the unsung labor, and the sheer resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary and extraordinarily awkward circumstances. They navigated a world with different rules, different fears, and very different ideas about what constituted a bad day at the office. The ingenuity displayed, whether it was the gong farmer's disposal system turning waste into fertilizer, the fuller's practical chemistry with urine, or the rat-catcher's complex partnership with animals, speaks to a deep human capacity to adapt and innovate, even in the most unpleasant of trades. And the social structures that evolved around these jobs, the guilds, the inherited roles, the paradoxical blend of necessity and revulsion, paint a rich picture of how medieval society grappled with tasks that were essential but undesirable. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your clean, comfortable bed, with your modern conveniences and, hopefully, a job that doesn't involve quite so much medieval muck or mortal peril, perhaps spare a thought for these unsung workers of the past. Their world was a tough one, often short, brutal, and filled with an astonishing array of awkward ways to earn a crust. But they faced it, day in and day out. And now, it's time for you to rest. May your dreams be sweet and entirely free of stale urine, hungry leeches, and the shadow of the executioner's axe. Sleep well.